are living in a time of a crisis upon a crisis. Who is most at risk? The countries that were weaker to begin with.
A crime has been committed against Ukraine, and we demand punishment for the murders of thousands of people.
Russia's unjustified aggression towards Ukraine continues to weigh on the economy in Europe and beyond.
The war in Ukraine is causing food and energy prices to skyrocket.
We have got to get inflation behind us. I wish there were a painless way to do that. There isn't.
The Federal Reserve is quite behind the curve. The European Central Bank quite behind the curve.
I don't think we can ever go into a full lockdown. We just can't do it in Hong Kong. We cannot have the same sort of lockdown you see in the mainland.
The wheels of history are rolling on towards China's reunification and the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
We are starting to see a series of decisions being taken by both countries that will lead us into more and more dangerous territory.
We are on a fast track to climate disaster.
Famine is at the door, and today we are receiving a final warning.
We have to keep trying and trying and trying, but the world must stand up if our citizens are to live a better life.
Dilemmas and disputes everywhere. It can seem so bleak, but history has proved no challenge is a match for human ingenuity and determination. We're ready. This is day 2 of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, Rebuilding.
Please welcome to the stage founder of Bloomberg LP and Bloomberg Philanthropies and 3-term mayor of New York City, Michael R. Bloomberg.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you. Welcome to day 2 of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. This morning, we were scheduled to hear from the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. But if you had seen the news this morning, there was people killed in Poland, and he's been pulled into conversations about that explosion just miles from the Ukrainian border, in which 2 people were killed. We'll hope to get him on later on, but for the moment, we still have plenty of things to do. Poland and NATO are investigating the causes of the disaster there and its implications. And our thoughts today are certainly with the people of the Ukraine and Poland as we begin today's discussions. Yesterday, we started the forum with what we called a reckoning, a hard look at the host of daunting challenges that leaders are counting and confronting across the world right now. Today, on day 2, we turn to rebuilding. And we'll explore the different possibilities that can stimulate innovation and economic growth, financing the clean energy transition, and more. But first, since this forum is focused on action and not talk, I'll kick things off with an announcement. Today, we are launching a new initiative to tackle an urgent issue that knows no borders, climate change, and we're going to zero in on one of the most important parts of the challenge: scaling the next generation of green technologies. Whether it is advanced batteries, or next generation solar and wind power, or biofuels, or hydrogen, we need to drive more investment and business know-how into promising green technologies, bringing them to scale faster. To help do that, we are launching the Bloomberg New Economy Climate Technology Coalition. And the membership of this coalition is truly international, with a steering committee made up of influential business leaders from China and India, Australia, Africa, and the Middle East, Europe, and North America. And that kind of global buy-in is both rare and necessary for a group like this. We're uniting technology and policy experts, financiers, and industrialists from around the world, all to accelerate the commercial availability of green technologies. And we're not sitting around waiting for either. This steering committee is here and will hold its first meeting this afternoon. I'll be there, and I want to thank the entire committee for their commitment and for leadership in creating this important and new initiative. Whether the topic is climate action and sustainable investing, or monetary policy, or international diplomacy, we have another full day ahead of us. So we'll get to it, and we're going to start with a panel moderated by Bloomberg's Tim O'Brien, who can share the latest on what's happening in Poland. So, Tim, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. We were shocked and surprised to discover this morning that the National Security Advisor prioritized world peace above our conference. So now you're stuck with us, and we hope we can still provide you with a very provocative and informative discussion about the theaters of war. I think all of us over the last year have been surprised to discover the extent to which we've reverted to almost a Cold War stance among the superpowers. And it has implications for world peace, obviously, for trade, for the economy, and for all of our well-being. And in order to explore that more deeply, I'm going to bring a few notable friends and journalistic colleagues onto the stage to discuss this with all of us. So Nissa Tajari is going to join us. He's a senior columnist at Bloomberg Opinion and an old friend. James Crabtree, researcher, analyst, author, and journalist extraordinaire. And John Micklethwaite, the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News. So much technology in so little time. So, John, I asked you earlier, are you an off-ramp guy? When we talk about Putin, obviously missiles fell in Poland overnight. This raises what's now been a month-long question about how to deal with Vladimir Putin. What are the consequences militarily of taking both a harder stance or a softer stance? And I'd be curious to know what you think right now, given what happened overnight. Where will NATO reside on this? And how should the U.S. think about Putin now?
I think several things. Firstly is on the question of the actual missiles, it's worth saying kind of very clearly that it's not absolutely cut and dried. These are Russian missiles fired by Russia because both sides use Russian missiles. It is possible that this was Ukrainian missiles trying to shoot down Russian missiles coming in. Whichever way, the kind of starting problem was Russian missiles coming through. Technically, Poland has the right to say that it's under attack and say this is an Article 4 moment. The difficulty with that, and that's where things get quite difficult, because you look at the way that Putin has thought about NATO, the way he's tried to test it. One of his deliberate ploys in the past was always to look at the idea of maybe countries like Estonia, those ones on the edge where you could begin to cause problems, and then you could try and get people to invoke the article. And once they've invoked the article, then maybe NATO would not rush because it would be seen as something inside. This particular case, if Poland was to go running and say, we want this to be a collective defense thing, people will say, well, look, it was just on the border, it was a mistake, etc. So anything that destabilizes NATO is generally something that Putin wants. It's been one of the great aims of his policy. And to begin with, in terms of reaching out towards or invading Ukraine, that was seen as one of the side effects. So this is one of those moments where you imagine everything is very clear. It's a Russian missile. Everyone's getting joined on one side. I'm not quite so sure. You could imagine some of the less vigorous members of NATO saying, look, this was obviously not an attack on Poland, etc., etc. So you have to be rather careful about what you imagine for. I think in the end, though, this is obviously bad for Putin. People like Nissa and James can talk about the effect in Asia. You've already had yesterday Xi Jinping and Biden coming together and talking about nuclear missiles and the desire to avoid that. Well, this is another sign that they also perhaps will think that Putin is out of control. The really interesting group in this is, I think, not the people in the West, it's the people in Moscow and the people around Putin. We know so little about that, and we probably won't know much until anything actually happens. But you have to imagine that the coalition of people in Russia who are hurting because of policies that Putin has taken on, and perhaps more importantly, policies that Putin has continued for reasons of personal survival, is growing. And this is another piece of evidence that some group of people close to Putin, or in that particular circle, might think it is time for a change. So that is, I think, the deeper risk to Putin.
Sort of stepping away from the minutiae of this incident and to think more broadly, philosophically, about how and militarily and economically, how the West should position itself towards Putin. I think there's an argument to be made that Putin was accommodated after the 2013 invasion of Crimea with the idea that that might settle him down. And now we've discovered that he didn't settle down, that in fact he's become more aggressive. So what would that recommend for how to respond right now to a war he's waging in Ukraine, and the best way to manage either an end to that war or a containment of Putin's ambitions?
I think the first point is very straightforward, is stay united. The more that NATO comes apart, the more that helps Putin in a way. I think in terms of his ambitions have all, if you even talk to him for a short while, it comes across. He wants a greater Russia. He thinks that Russia was humiliated, and he sees that's the starting point. But his actual tactics of going through it are pretty opportunistic. I think when he sees weakness, he goes for it. And I think particularly when it came up to Crimea, and for a long time, America in particular, made the mistake of being dismissive about Putin, rude basically in public, which was not something that was going to ever make
and in his view, provocative,
but not standing up to him, and that was the problem. Putin senses weakness. If you talk to Putin privately,
which you have,
yeah, all he will ever ask you about is he will ask you about world leaders, he's an old-style KGB agent. He wants to know what people's weaknesses are and what their strengths are. And this precise moment, he will be recalibrating and trying to think what the weaknesses of the NATO are. He's a realist, Putin. I think people often look and see what he's done in the Ukraine and say this is the act of someone who's unhinged. What he did in Ukraine is deeply evil. But if you follow the consequence of having made a botched invasion, you could argue that someone whose regime and possibly whose life and also the lives of his family and everything else depends on him being able to have some kind of quote-unquote successful, or being able to claim something out of Ukraine, everything he's done recently fits fairly logically into that stream. Putin needs an out.
But he's just been embarrassed again, too, by this. He's just been embarrassed again.
Yes.
He's got a military that he doesn't appear to have great control over. He's got a military that was, proclaimed as a 21st century machine, but it looks like a 15th century apparatus run by 16th century thinkers.
This has happened before. If you remember the missile that struck down the Malaysian airline, that was a Russian missile. It was established. So once even on a stage like this, I put it to Putin that there are two explanations. Either number one, he deliberately shot down the Malaysian airliner, or number two, his armed forces are so incompetent they can't keep hold of their missiles. That is the problem about Russia is big and disorganized and frightened of a man at the top. So in terms of one of the initial things Putin will be trying to do is trying to work out whether this did happen, that didn't. We've all seen how chaotic parts of the Russian military are and how incompetent they are. So he's got that to deal with as well. So I think from his point of view, his first thought will be always hanging on to domestic power. Not perhaps that unlike our Chinese counterpart, but the same basic starting point.
Which is a nice segue, James, into talking about the fact that President Xi is undoubtedly watching the U.S. response to Ukraine and the Western European response to the Ukraine invasion, and wondering how that adds up in his own view of whether or not to reabsorb Taiwan into the PRC. What do you think Xi is going to conclude from today's episode? What kind of a response would he want to see? And And do you feel optimistic, given at least some of the more diplomatic language that's come out of the meeting in Bali this week? Both Xi and Biden jointly said they found the possibility of Putin using nukes as reprehensible. That seemed like a bright spot in what has otherwise been a troubled relationship.
I think John's right. This is a bad week for Putin. What Xi would want is the most disorganized and disunited NATO response possible. I don't think that's what they're going to get. I mean, my sense is that what will come out of this in the European side will be that those voices who've been calling for more help for Ukraine, so the Baltic nations, Poland in particular, the Eastern Europeans, the United Kingdom, want to give new missile systems to Ukraine, want to give more weapons of different sorts. They're going to have the wind at their back now, as you have a meeting tomorrow in the G7 meeting in Bali. For China-US, the meeting this week between Xi and Biden, I think, it surprised on the upside. It was more constructive than people were expecting. That was also true of the 4 or 5 phone calls they've had before. But it doesn't change the underlying fundamental problem between the US and China, which is that you can have more crises over Taiwan or anywhere else, and there are all sorts of reasons they disagree. So the fact that when Biden and Xi talk to one another, it lowers the temperature just a little bit, doesn't solve any of the underlying structural problems. And there's no sign that even these occasional conversations that they have make any progress in solving those structural problems. They simply cool things down for a little bit until the next blow up.
I was in Japan a couple weeks ago, and Nisit and our other colleagues met with various U.S. and Japanese officials, and it's very front of mind right now in Japan that, in their view, that it's not a question of if, but when, in terms of China invading Taiwan. Play with that idea for a minute. Do you think it's inevitable that China is going to try to absorb Taiwan militarily, directly, or through back channels? And if and when that happens, what do you think the consequences would be?
I genuinely don't think anybody knows. So we at the IISS have China analysts. They tend to be more sober than the American voices that you hear with a specific timetable of 2 years or 5 years. I would be surprised if such a timetable exists. I think President Xi is creating a military that is going to be capable of trying to do that in 5 to 10 years' time, but I don't think that any decision has been made, and I think China would prefer a situation in which there was a peaceful Hong Kong-style bringing together. I think the more likely scenario is that we are entering an era in which the crisis that we saw over the Pelosi visit, that kind of tension over Taiwan is just going to become more common. So between the third and what you might call the fourth Taiwan crisis, there was more than a decade. I don't think we're going to have to wait very long before we have another crisis over Taiwan. And that will be the challenge that Biden and Xi can talk to one another from time to time. But if we enter a period in which periods of crisis over Taiwan are more common, then the risk of escalation becomes much more real. And that, I think, is what worries people in Southeast Asia in particular. Not that Xi is going to decide to invade in a year's time, which he might do, but it's quite unlikely, but more that you stumble into a conflict through an accidental escalation of something that starts out quite small but gets bigger.
World War I.
Very similar. I mean, very similar. A lot of people have been reading the book about sleepwalking into World War I, and it has some analogies. So very different. This is a maritime region, not a land combat region. But if you look at the run at the 5 years before World War I, there were a series of crises. Not every single one of them, they were de-escalated, but they created tensions, and then eventually they created the context in which the road to war happened. So I think there are lessons to be learned from that period in history, yes.
You know, Nisit, in the context of random actors in all of this, we also have North Korea. And they've launched in recent weeks, I think, over 24 missiles, not far off the shores of Japan, also alarming the Japanese. Is China doing enough to rein in North Korea, or are they quite happy to have North Korea be a provocative actor in the region?
I think they're quite happy to have North Korea be a provocative actor up to a certain point, right? Something that destabilizes the U.S., distracts the U.S. Is fine. It's the same reason, one of the reasons why China supports Pakistan so much, because it distracts India a bit, distracts them attention-wise, resources, and so on. But I don't think China wants to provoke a crisis on the Korean Peninsula. I think Biden made very clear in his meeting with Xi that the natural reaction of the U.S. and Japan and South Korea to these missile tests is going to be a much larger and stronger U.S. military presence in the region. And that is the last thing China wants to see. So I think, Xi Jinping at this moment probably desires stability more than anything else. I think if he wants to show some goodwill, if he wants to build on this meeting that he had with Biden, both sides need to do things that start to build a little bit of trust between them. This is a relatively easy place where he could try and exert some influence. It's not to say that he has full control over what Kim Jong-un does and can tell him what to do. It's far from that at this point. He can express his displeasure. He can sort of make clear where he stands. Same thing with Putin as well. I think if this is a little more unlikely because the reasons China has supported Russia in this particular case are very long-term and broad and strategic and have to do with the fact that they both see the U.S. as an enemy. But she does not want to see Putin be outright defeated, cast out of power. And if this leads to a broader war, if it leads to a stronger NATO response, again, that's going to disrupt the global economy. It's going to threaten Putin's rule. China has an interest in trying to forestall that.
So does the Indo-Pacific region need its own version of NATO?
I don't think so. I don't think you would be able to get one, first of all. I don't think the countries in the region, that's what they're looking for. I think what you have right now, these sort of overlapping mini-lateral groupings, AUKUS with Australia, the UK, and the US. The Quad is not a military alliance, but has some coordination functions. And then the bilateral U.S. alliances with Japan, South Korea, and so on. I think those are probably enough, with enough coordination to bolster deterrence against China and also able to keep everyone on side, right? I think what you don't want to do is start pushing countries to choose, are you going to join this organization or are you going to keep trading with China and so on. They don't want to do that. They never have, and there's no reason for them to start now.
Our time has already whipped by. I'm going to do a little rapid fire round and then we'll conclude. John, will Vladimir Putin use a nuke in Europe? Yes or no?
No. No, and I think there is one interesting point which, on what Nissa was built, I think China has a strategic interest in standing by Russia. I'm not quite sure it has a strategic interest in standing by Vladimir Putin.
James, will President Xi continue down a path of closing China in and off from the rest of the world, or are some of the baby steps he took this week around opening both the economy up a little bit and opening the country itself up to more diplomatic channels continue?
The former, not the latter. I think China is moving on a path towards technological self-reliance, and that's in part because the Americans are forcing them to do that.
Nissa, do the midterm results in the U.S. give Biden a stronger hand to play around national security issues and foreign affairs?
A little bit. I wouldn't overestimate it, but it does. The opposite case, if there had been a red wave, would have weakened him dramatically, I think. So this is a bit better for him.
All right. Thank you guys for joining us at the last minute, and thank all of you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Editorial Director of Bloomberg New Economy, Eric Schatzker.
Good morning, everybody. It is so good to see all of you here for day 2 of the New Economy Forum. This, as Mike told you just moments ago, is where we turn our focus to rebuilding, though, of course, tragically, there is still more reckoning to be done after the latest developments in Ukraine and in Poland. Today, we're going to welcome to the main stage some of the world's most talented managers, builders, innovators, and investors. The conversations they'll have will range widely from decarbonizing the atmosphere to startup financing to action planning for the global food crisis. Like I said yesterday, it's a rich mix of content, timely, provocative, and necessary. Once again, I have a few reminders to share with you. Number one, live translation. Those of you who weren't here yesterday, please take note. Should you need live translation, there is an earpiece at every seat. The Bloomberg New Economy app. You'll need it to participate in live polling and also to submit questions you want asked of the speakers. Same 3 download options as yesterday. Number one, scan the QR code right there. Number 2, go to your app store and enter Bloomberg New Economy. Or number 3, in your browser, type bloombergneweconomy.com/app. The more you engage, the more you participate, the better off we all are. And please don't forget to share on your social channels with the hashtag New Economy Forum. One final reminder, if you haven't already done so, we need you to turn on Bloomberg New Economy notifications. This is the single best way to stay on top of any scheduling changes, and there will be some, as well as important announcements. Whether you're on an iPhone or an Android handset, it's easy. But listen up so I can explain how it works. Go to your phone settings. You don't have to do this right now. Click on notifications. I'm sure you've done this before. Find the Bloomberg New Economy app and turn the notifications on. It's that easy. Now on with the show, everybody. I'd like to welcome to the stage Zanny Minton-Beddoes. She is editor-in-chief of The Economist, and her panelists, His Excellency Khaldoon Khalifa Al-Mubarak, Managing Director and the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Mubadala Investment Company, Lizzie Johnson, Chief Executive Officer of Swedbank Robur, Lim Chiao Kiat, the Chief Executive Officer of GIC Private Limited, and Neil Shen, the founding and managing partner of Sequoia Capital China. Welcome.
Thank you, Eric. Morning, everybody. Morning to all of you. So following on from that very upbeat early panel about rising geopolitical uncertainties right now, we are going to focus on exactly what Eric has asked us to do, rebuilding. How are we going to get growth in a world where you can no longer rely on loose monetary policy and fiscal stimulus? We have geopolitical uncertainty. We have no easy solutions in terms of loose fiscal and monetary policy. But we need to get growth going. And we have, luckily, here around me, some of the biggest asset allocators and with the biggest amounts of private capital around. So let's go straight into it. We have 36 minutes, so I want us to talk about 4 topics. Where will the growth come from? How do you boost innovation? What's the role of private capital? And how do you link the two, particularly in the energy transition? So, Chaukat, can I start with you? You are a large source of funds. Where are you in this new environment looking for growth? What regions, what sectors?
Right. Well, good morning. Let's, looked at the macro picture, right? I will start with the higher real interest rate. That's a big headwind for almost every asset class. So that already is a difficult starting point. But having said that, especially for long-term investors, having higher asset yield is a good thing. Because if you look at long-term return, the compounding of higher yield is the driver of longer-term return. Now, with that in mind, of course, you look around the world and, looked at, I guess, the different growth and inflation mixes, you would see that, we are still dealing, right, with the inflation pressures. But there have been some good, you might say, structural developments. I would, in fact, highlight the US as an interesting market. Valuation may not be quite there yet, but if you looked at some of the longer-term trends, for example, the government incentives to really reindustrialize the economy, that's a big positive. And we are pretty confident that down the road, we should be able to find good investment opportunities out of that. And there are some other trends of supply chain realignment that should benefit countries in this region, perhaps India, Mexico. So these are also places where, you could see more capital allocation.
Thank you. That's a great place to start. So the US, supply chain realignment, the incentives that are coming from US policies. Khaldun, what's your take on this? Where are you looking?
I think very similar. We look at the same lens. I think particularly us in Singapore, we have a lot of commonality in terms of how we think and how we look. I think you have to look at the glass half full. So I think when you look at inflation, high interest rate, at the end of the day, I think this is a much needed correction that's happening in terms of where the world was going over the last 5 to 7 years, and the adjustment that's coming about right now, which I think for investors such as ourselves, looking at it from a long-term perspective, the valuations now are coming to a much better place. I still think there's more pain, generally speaking, but I think we will have more opportunities than less opportunities in the time ahead of us. In terms of sectors, I'll answer you just quickly in terms of sectors and in terms of the geographic look. Sectors, very much the same thematic spaces that we in Mubadala have been focusing on for the last 5 years. What we define as areas with headwinds remain thematically the same today as they were probably 5 years ago. Energy transition remains a very core area of investment for us. Life sciences, the healthcare space, I think, again, thematically remains a focus area for us. Technology, digitalization, digital infrastructure, and infrastructure also. So I think these spaces remain and haven't changed thematically for us. We remain, I think, very firm in our views that these are sectors with tailwinds, and we will continue to invest in those spaces. Geographically speaking, I agree. I think the U.S. market remains, I think, a very, very attractive market, even as we see valuations now adjust there. I think it'll be more interesting in the time to come. It remains, I think, a core area for us. We're focusing a lot on Asia. We're doing a lot in Asia, across Asia. And that, again, from a growth perspective, we see a lot of growth potential there as we see supply chains readjust, and as we see some of the markets also, again, awaken. You mentioned India. India is a very, very interesting market. We were talking, behind the scenes over there about Indonesia. Indonesia is another very interesting market. But that continues. I remain also very keen on growing our portfolio in China. So I think overall, China, India, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia is an area of focus for us.
Interesting. I'm going to get to China in just a second, Neil, but Lisa, first I wanted to bring you in and are your customers behaving differently now? Do you sense a change in this new environment of higher rates, less stimulus? Any change from Europe?
Definitely so. And just put the perspective, since I'm an asset manager and not an asset owner, the allocation is partly or mostly driven by the customers' allocations. And since it's a lot of retail customers, it's an interesting pattern to follow. But yes, of course, they're taking down the risk. But the interesting part is how we actually future-proof the portfolios. Because if you have a global portfolio, and as you said, we moved and we sort of swifted the portfolios completely, and we started 5 years ago. So it's a lot based on the thematic investments, and those are the themes that you're mentioning about securing the future. So the chaos in the world, if I can use a word that strong right now, doesn't fundamentally change anything in our allocation, because we are really trying to find those sectors that are there and looking at the future growth. So when I speak to my portfolio managers, there's no change in that, but of course they're looking more at healthcare.
So not much asset allocation change.
No.
Despite this. That's interesting.
Yeah, but a lot going on, and of course we see also that the bonds are sort of growing in interest now that you can actually get a decent yield there. But most importantly, I think also when you look at the future perspective is that you shouldn't only look at the risk-return perspective, but if you add a sustainability in it, then you get the long-term horizon, and then it's easier to navigate in this environment.
So that lens makes you think more long-term. We're going to come back to that later in this conversation. But Neil, first of all, China, the one part of the world that doesn't seem to have been doing terribly well recently economically is China. How are you thinking differently, and particularly actually venture capital in China? Are you thinking differently about investing and allocating capital in this new environment?
Yeah, I think first of all, I'm going to talking from probably a global perspective. Clearly, I have a lot of focus on China. traditionally, over the last 17, 20 years, we always looking for growth. And that growth is still there. I think if you're looking at some of those new sectors, climate tech's definitely become the mainstream of all the investment resources. The launch of this climate coalition highlight that this is such an important topic. Obviously, new energy is a very important part of it, but not just limited to new energy. We have metaverse, XR, AR, VR, and we have healthcare, which is always a very important area. And all those growths still driven by the same parameter, technology innovation. On the other hand, in the recent times, in recent months, we are now actually looking at investment from another angle, which is value. Indeed, over the last 5 years, there's a bunch of leading consumer internet companies being built, and now their growth has been somewhat impacted negatively because of the high interest rate, economic slowdown, and so on. But they largely has consolidated the market, and they become a dominant leader in many of their sectors, and they getting a lot more profitable because less competition. And given the recent sell-down in the public market, the primary market also adjusted. So we're starting to see actually the first time that in the tech space, the value companies, the value stock, you can look at it as the investment target. So
far from being uninvestable, China's cheap. Is that what you're saying?
Well, even in U.S., although the valuation hasn't been adjusted that much, very similar. But I would say China, U.S., if you look at a few sectors, consumer internet being one of them, indeed, valuation getting very, very reasonable.
Interesting. Let's move on to the second theme, which was innovation and how you boost innovation. Because I'm very struck, Chakat, that you started off saying one of the reasons you were interested in the U.S. was the incentives for reindustrialization. And what we're seeing now, just to give you a sense, global spending on R&D exceeded 2.1 trillion last year, which is 2.5% of GDP, which is a record for quite a while. It's a global record. But the nature of the climate for innovation is now quite different. It's much more government directed. There's huge incentives, as you say, in the US. There's huge incentives in China. Everyone's into industrial policy. It's the very keen thing. But you think that's a good thing for boosting investment?
Well, generally it's a good thing, right? We need more money to do the long-term stuff. Obviously, you have to look at kind of individual cases. But in quite a lot of areas, without government incentive, it's hard to kickstart that process. Let's take climate, for example. This whole decarbonization is going to take money, right? It's going to result in higher costs. And even with new technology, and it's great that Bloomberg is leading this new effort on climate tech, you need initial capital. Of course, private capital can come in, but to really scale, I think you really have to explore, blended finance and other kinds of arrangements. So to that extent, I think, in quite a few areas, government incentive is almost a must. So private side, we continue to see private capital flowing into innovation space. Of course, we all have to recognize that, and Neil is an expert in this, right, that the success rate of startup is not exactly super high, right? So everybody has to go in with their eyes open. But certainly, if you look at in aggregate, it's well worth private capital to go into that space because they really can change the world. So as far as GIC is concerned, we are committed to do more.
So when you are looking at your investment allocation now, are you looking to see how much governments are providing incentives, how active the industrial policy is in different countries?
That certainly is an important consideration.
Now, the corollary of that, of course, is that governments, particularly the US government, have also been much more active in terms of trying to disrupt the flow of technology, export controls, and so forth, increasing use of sanctions. Khaldun, how has that environment changed your asset allocation decision? Are we in a more fragmented world, and does that affect how you think about where you invest?
I don't think it affects the way or where we invest, per se. But if you allow me to bridge back into it by just continuing on what Lim was saying, innovation and technology, I think, is a key driver. I think you heard it from all of us here. It's a key driver for us as investors. It's the future. It's what's been doing so well over the last years, obviously, and it's what's going to change everything going forward. So we have to keep focused in that space. I think when governments spur growth by supporting investment in technology and innovation, in R&D, I think that's great. I'm very supportive of that, and I think it's very important. It's a good indicator, I think, from an investor perspective when we see governments do that. When we see governments support industrial growth, advanced manufacturing, again, that's a positive. I'm more skeptical when governments go and give just money for people to sit at home or to reduce costs. I think that is money that's not really producing, ultimately, a long-term net rate of return from a macro perspective. So I think, going back, just to conclude that point, supportive of, and I think that's a good thing, and I think when governments do that, particularly in an educated and thoughtful way with a long-term view, I think that's a net positive, and we see that from an investor perspective as a strong indicator. Going back to your question, I think, from a UAE perspective, globalization, being a small country, being a country that's throughout its history been a trade hub between east, west, north, south. We're all for globalization. We're all for less boundaries, connectivity, trade flows. I think this is something that is done well for the UAE, and it's something that we encourage. And from an investor perspective, I think it's, I see the efficiencies of efficient value chains rather than inefficient value chains that are constructed for geopolitical reasons rather than for the efficiency of productivity ultimately. Value chains, and we've seen that through COVID. The world started fighting, or this fight against this pandemic, in the first stage, fractured, and looking at it insularly. Each country was looking in the early first wave, not in a collaborative approach, but rather we've seen herding of simple stuff like medical equipment, N95 masks, testing equipment. I mean, it was very difficult in the early stages. It's only when we started opening up the supply chains and working collaboratively on everything, from vaccines to that, the world found its way out of that pandemic. So I think there's a lot of value in collaboration. There's a lot of value in opening up the value chains, the supply chains. I see a lot of value in moving away from restrictive measures.
You're being very diplomatic, but can I take this to be essentially a criticism of quite a lot of current policy, which is clearly moving in the opposite direction?
You can take it in whatever way you want. What I'm saying is I'm supportive non-restrictive measures.
Neil, one of the biggest recent disruptions has been the US imposition of export controls on super high-end chips. I'm not expecting you to comment on that directly, but can you give me a sense of whether that is going to really set back the pace of innovation within China, or whether there will be greater efforts to accelerate to try and catch up?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at innovation, there's a few sort of areas that, sort of places that those innovations are happening. One is these happen with the universities, whether it's the US, in China, or in Europe. The second with the major corporates, and similarly across the globals. And then lastly, with the startups. So from our perspective, the third part is very important because those oftentimes is able to really make a difference and try to disrupt whatever the big guy have, and also try to turn the first one, those research lab scientific findings into real life applications. For that purpose, I haven't seen much change because those innovators, those entrepreneurs in the early stage is less effective because of high interest rate, public market sell down, or high inflation. In fact, what's more important is the investors, venture investor in particular, and how they can do a better job, enable them and helping them to grow. So I think, in a way, this is what exactly the role that the investor should do. And we're not only just sitting there and providing funding, but we should really get involved deeply in this whole process. When we launched this climate technology coalition, it reminds me one thing. Back 200 years ago, in Birmingham, UK, there's one interesting organization called the Lunar Society, where many of those innovators and industrialists, financiers are getting together, brainstorming, and try to work out productive solutions. And then obviously creating the steam engines, and that's the very first industrial revolution. I think we should do the same thing. We should have people from the different sort of angles and try to come together and find solutions which are addressing the global, I think, issues like climate change.
We're going to come to those because climate is clearly an area where the private sector and government works together. But just to ask you one more China-related question, because I think for many people around the world are really interested in what exactly is the nature of the new degree of cooperation between the Chinese government and innovation. I mean, there seems to be much greater government involvement now in innovation in China than there was.
Well, in the last 17, 20 years.
No, in the last 2 3
yeah. There are certain sectors, clearly you see more, sort of government funding. But in general, private sector is still the major driving force of, the money flow. We obviously see like some of the, provincial governments set up so-called guidance funds, which, more or less is really contributing to the limited capital, limited part of, capital flows for the RMB. But the overseas investors and the private sector is still the major source of that, innovation fund.
So those guidance funds are not a big part of your life right now?
No.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, one important and crucial thing for innovation is human capital, and boosting of skills and boosting of human capital. What is your sense of how much needs to change there?
I'm not sure what needs to change, but if I sort of return to the original question about substitutes and other things, I mean, what we need to get that innovation and get those people going all in is predictability. And we were talking yesterday, or someone on the panels, about how you actually get more capital into innovation and to these new technologies. And then you need the regulations clear, and you need a path forward, because right now the regulations are continue to shift, and the governmental sort of incentives, they come and go. And if you don't get that long-term commitment from the public side, it's very hard to get the risk-willing private capital in there. So I think those two are interconnected. So make sure that you know the game plan, and then you can add a human capital and a private capital into the innovation.
So from your perspective, too much unpredictability right now?
Absolutely, yeah.
Chaukat, where are you seeing the most promising talent? I mean, which parts of the world, where is talent moving to?
Well, I would say, of course, there are the big pockets, in the US, in China, different part, Europe as well. But really, I mean, talent's mobile. Right? I think talent goes to where other talents are. Talent goes to where there's some predictability, right, of the environment that allows them to do the work that they would like to do. So to that extent, I think you really have to bring together quite a few things, right? Bring enough talent to a place, or if you already have them, keep them there. And then you have to have money, right? Because you have to fund a lot of these efforts that the talents need in order to take it further. And then you need the environment to be supportive, right? Can be down to simple things like housing, visas, and things like that. So to that extent, I think Asia is seeing some pockets of that. Perhaps
Singapore's not doing too badly.
Singapore has a bit of that benefit, right? We just have to deal with our capacity challenge. And yeah, that's the way to go.
Khaldun, what about you? You when you go around the world, where are you most excited about the quality of talent, people coming? Where are you? Which parts? Because that, particularly in the kind of innovative sectors that you mentioned, healthcare, so forth, talent really is essential. Where are you most excited about?
So I think you always have to look at the education sector. You have to look at countries where they have a strong education, primary education system, college, graduate, undergraduate and graduates. That's really the main driver. But I think the big change that we've seen over the last couple of years is this point about mobility of talent. Two things have changed. One, I think we discovered virtual and the value of virtual and the applicability of virtual on day-to-day business, combined with now in the post, let's say, COVID era, using what we've seen from a technological standpoint of operating in a virtual environment with now bringing in mobility back, where travel is coming back and ability to move much quicker. I think these dynamics, we're going to see a change in the mobility of talent from now forward. That's going to be driven by quality of life, education sector, especially a lot of the talent are younger folks, younger families. So I think the quality of life linked is also the quality of education for the children. Security, I think this is a point that is coming more and more right now as a critical point. Quality of life and security, and I think this is where I will agree. Many of the Asian countries, and again using the example of the UAE and Singapore, I think are good examples in which all of the above, quality of life, education, security, are net positives in the selection for talent to move and go to. Today, talent is. It's not about nationality anymore. It's not about it's about ease of movement and locations that can actually make it easy to access, easy to set up, easy to move, easy to operate, and then provide the technological ability to operate technically or technologically, and the mobility in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of airlines, etc. That's kind of where this is going, I believe, and I think UAE and Singapore are very well positioned in that space.
Your office here growing?
Sorry?
Your office here is growing?
Yes, in Asia. We're building operations in many places in Asia.
Let's turn to the structures of finance that will be the ones that grow fastest in this new world. And maybe, Neil, I'll start with you, perhaps somewhat provocatively. Has venture capital had it?
Well, I think we, as I said, economics, cycles up and down. There's still is a very, very important catalyst for innovations. Frankly, that this is getting even more important today, than before. And back to my point, I say it's important to have the venture capitalists to play a more important role, just being a founding partner, but become an enabling partner. And I think today that the incubation is almost a requirement to be a successful venture capitalist. And we can play a role because once we have insights about the sector we operate, you can really put people together. Like, we're building a few incubation centers in China. And, the very important things like, we can bring, for example, industrial venture together with, the KOLs from hospitals and to creating something for medical device. And we can do the same thing for climate tech. We can bring, the leading, battery companies together with some, research, team which are developing, the next generation of, material and put them together. And that's exactly, the type of stuff that, a venture capitalist should do. We're not, just a financier per se, but we become an operator. And this is where I think the venture capitalists, have to do, in the future, instead of looking at the deal flows passively and try to be another, minority investor.
That's actually a really important point. In some ways, and I was obviously being somewhat flippant with my earlier question, but in an environment where actually it's tougher, where real rates are higher, does that force you to kind of go back to what VC was really all about, which is finding and incubating?
That's a very good question, because over the last 10 years, there's some good times that you can, invest in the growth companies, and they seem to be, at least growing valuations, every 3 months or every 6 months, and the public market has been awarded with some very rich premiums. Today, the market has changed completely. So you have to go back to say, roll up your sleeve and invest early. And how do you invest early? You have to creating companies, or at least participate in creating the companies. And that's not easy. And it means that you have to be very specialized. One thing I took notice that when I visited Silicon Valley back 25 years ago, when I visited every single firm, I find that many of those partners are from the industries. They're really like the CEOs and CXOs. But here in Asia, I have to say, over the last 10 years, you see that up and coming, but not yet. And most of these people are from consulting, from banking. I'm not trying to criticize the people with that kind of background, but look, with our operating background, it helps a lot. So you can really become partner to the CEOs and founders. And that's the only way that I think, venture capital can creating value and creating returns.
Turkat, what do you think? In this sort of tougher environment where we've no longer got free money, what kind of capital structures, what kind of vehicles do you think will you be looking more at?
Right. Well, I agree totally with Neil. I think the venture, is going to stay as an important part of finance. It has, in fact, over the last maybe 10, 15 years, gotten, I guess, new structural advantage. For example, technologies now enable a lot of these startups to sell directly to customers. It used to be that they had to sell to some big, companies. Now you can go directly. That allows you, of course, better margins and scaling, right? So these kind of structural changes are in place. So that's not going to change. But at the same time, there is scarcity of capital, right? Higher real interest rate, availability of capital is a lot less. So I think a lot of the growth or startup companies need to be making sure that their balance sheets are strong. They have the cost discipline to stay through this period. And in fact, I think for those who play the long game, they will benefit because some of the weaker ones will fall out, right? And they will then enjoy, actually a more rational, competitive landscape. So certainly, I think for investors, that is still an important allocation that we need to have, whether it's the early stage venture or even the growth aspect of it.
Lisa, I want to turn now the time we've got left to the one area where everyone recognizes there could be huge progress, which is green investing, sustainable investing, financing the green transition that everyone recognizes is necessary. What do you think is still missing for private capital to really accelerate this transition? Is there anything on your wish list that you would like to see there?
Yeah, I need new investment vehicles in Europe where I can actually allocate pension capital for retail clients into this sphere, because there's a lot of value created there, and I also believe that the solutions to most of the issues we're discussing here, and if I just speak to the companies presented here at the Bloomberg Forum, a lot of it is private capital, private companies, and they are working for the global solutions, and I can't invest in them right now. But if I would have an investment vehicle that actually allowed me not to have daily liquidity in my pension funds, I mean, there could be huge flow of capital into the sector where it's very much needed. So there's definitely a lot of potential there.
So you need that. Khaldoon, what is needed to get the scale of capital necessary, particularly to the emerging countries, which are going to be the place where this climate transition is decided? You need to get emissions down there. Is it what's going on in Sharm el-Sheikh? Is it the private sector? Is it new vehicles linking the two? What needs to happen? Clearly, the Bloomberg initiative is great, but I suspect more will be needed.
So I'll use 3 words, which maybe some of them will be conflicting. Sprint, patience, and wisdom. I think we need to sprint, but we also need to be patient. And you need to be wise in how we invest. What do I mean by all of that? On the energy transition side, energy transition, from my perspective, is about continuing to invest in conventional oil and gas, in wind, in solar, in nuclear, in hydrogen, in all of the above. The solution is all of the above. Not let's switch off investing in conventional energy and let's just put all our investment in renewables and new energies, that creates the situation we're in today, which is a situation where there was underinvestment for a long period of time, creating ultimately the energy crisis that we're in right now. Of course, there's other components that add to it, but at its heart, there are institutions, maybe some around the table here today, that could not have invested in conventional energy for many reasons: lack of ability to finance, many of the impediments that were put to that, and that created the challenge. I think on an ongoing forward basis, I think we need to, in my view, accept that the energy transition is a solution that encompasses all of the above. And we have to invest in all of the above. We have to sprint in investing in new technologies, wind, solar, hydrogen, ammonia, etc. But we also need to be wise in continuing to invest in that transition with energy sources that are available right now and that are a critical component of that energy transition process.
So sprint, strength, and wisdom. Neil, what do you think is missing in terms of financing vehicles?
We need innovative financing solutions in ecosystem. It took 20 years for the solar sector, for the EV and EV value chain to really build and scale. Today, for example, hydrogen is a very, very important area. Everyone knows about it, but how to scale up? There's a big question because, it's a kind of chicken egg issue. We can use solar and wind to produce hydrogen, and hydrogen turn to ammonia, which could be easily transported. But, because the market is small for, as people just started, right? And then you cannot really take a long-term contract, offtake agreement, because there's not like, liquid, sort of commodity that you can lock in the price. And because of that, bank financing is difficult. So it's kind of chicken egg. So what kind of financing solution can make a breakthrough so that this whole closed loop could be,
So answer your own question. What kind of financing?
Yeah, I think we need, leading corporates to make a big push into that. You need, different type of financing solutions, mass debt, mass financings, debt, equity to come together and solve that, that particular equation.
Chaukat, what's your take on that? And this will probably be the last word. You have a lot of money that you can throw at this. What are the structures that are missing?
Well, it's back to the two areas, right? New technologies. I think that, if we can develop off-take market, I think that will greatly help to scale, that will lower the cost curve, that will get the whole infrastructure going in that space. The other is transition finance, that I think we have had some success actually, for example, with a utility in the US, giving them $2 billion actually to convert from coal to renewable. And the regulators there, very importantly, the regulators, we would say, were very enlightened, right? That they looked at this as necessary, and they allow a slight increase of rates for consumers. But that allows that whole transition to take place. So I think we need more examples of that.
And are you optimistic, yes or no, from all of you, that we are on the path to achieving that?
I think we have to work hard and harder. It's a challenge.
No, but definitely 2/3 of the global population live where renewable energy is actually cheaper to produce than just continue to use depreciated fossil energies. I think that says a lot.
Says a lot. Yes or no? You're optimistic that we're going to get there?
Yes, I'm optimistic.
Yeah, but, like Cardone said, we need to be patient. But I hope this time it's not 20 years, maybe it's 10 years.
Thank you all. Sprint, patience, wisdom. Very good way to end. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Please welcome our panellists, Senator for South Australia in the Parliament of Australia, Sarah Hanson-Young. Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Sinovation Ventures, Kai-Fu Lee. Chief Executive Officer of MasterCard, Michael Miebach. Minister for Communications and Information of the Republic of Singapore, Josephine Teo. And our moderator, anchor for Bloomberg Television, Francine Lackwell.
Hi, everyone. I have an iPad. I want to see many, many questions, so please don't be shy. We are expecting a lot of questions on this very important panel. First of all, thank you so much to all of our panelists for being here. Now, let's just remind ourselves, in the span of just a couple of decades, the public perception of technology moved quickly from an attitude of optimism, lauding its transformative capacity to connect humanity, to something that maybe we should be a little bit more wary of. So over the next 40 minutes, we're going to try and talk about that trust and what needs to be done to rebuild it. Minister, let's kick off with you. When you look at that trust, was there a moment in time where that trust with technology, data, was lost?
I don't think there is a precise moment, but cumulatively, there is now widespread recognition that we have a serious problem, and yet there is no silver bullet. People, on a day-to-day basis, transact digitally to a very large extent. And they know of people in their circle, family and friends, that have one way or another been hurt. And so that feeds into their own understanding. They themselves may have been victims. I think it will take serious effort on the part of multiple stakeholders to try and address this. It will probably require thoughtful regulations of some sort that are appropriate, that understands technology, that are able to address issues effectively. It will also take corporates strengthening the safeguards. And I think very importantly, we have to help people rebuild their confidence in going digital. They have been, burnt enough times that confidence has been eroded. And whether it is through government effort or crowding in resources from amongst corporates as well as the people sector, we have to try and rebuild that trust.
Michael, where do you see that trust being eroded? And actually, why? Is it cyber attacks? Is it data usage? Something's changed, for sure.
Yeah, I think we've seen a rise in distrust over the last 2.5 years. So the world has become a lot more digital. A function of COVID, a lot more people use digital tools. And combination of unfamiliarity, as the minister said, cyber risks that have suddenly appeared out of nowhere because using a new digital tool and so forth. So we've seen a rise. When you look across the board, distrust comes from, hey, I'm not even part of that digital economy. So there's an access issue, for sure. So there's a lot of people who don't trust the world that is digital while they are digital have-nots. Cyber is the obvious one. If you take some of the numbers, they're just astounding. There's a study that I read, 2025, $10.5 trillion of financial impact on the global economy as a result of cyber attacks. So that's huge. We can spend a whole panel on that alone, so I'll move on. The one that I think is particularly tricky is on data. So the data responsibility part, as you said, private sector stepping up. If you don't know where your data is going, what your data is being used for, who stores it, who has it, and all of that, that's worrying. And if the answer to that is a 17-page click on consent that you will never read, that's problematic. Yeah. That drives distrust. And I think that is the opportunity for a combination of private sector and regulation to do something about it. Data responsibility, I think, is top of the list for me.
So, Sarah, first of all, when you look at trust and the trust issue, it matters, right? Because it's how we interact. And if people do just consent without reading, then maybe it changes the way we use data and live our lives in the future.
Absolutely. I think the trust deficit in this is essential. And from a political perspective, as politicians, we hear this all the time because the community is increasingly distrusting. They're distrusting of the big platforms. Those tech giants, they're distrusting of what if governments are protecting their needs or the corporations. They're being told on these platforms not to trust their politicians in many respects. So there is this whole ecosystem that is actually being self-fed, that is based on
less trust, more fear, and increasingly that leads to harm. In Australia, in just recent weeks, we've had a huge scandal where people's very personal information, their driver's license, their passports, their home address, their electricity bills have been leaked and hacked through a telecommunications company and then also through a private health fund. And this is, and people are horrified. 10 million Australians need to get new passports now because their information has been leaked online.
But Sarah, who's at fault? So, and I know we don't want to turn this into finger pointing, but if you also pinpoint to, who's...
I think it's twofold. I think, one, governments have been far too slow to act. The regulatory system is a decade at least behind. We need proper regulation for this space. But also, I think there are kind of the gorillas in the room, the big tech giants who have taken advantage of this for far too long. They've taken advantage of a no-rules barred approach and this kind of sense that there had been in the community that what happens online is different. It's exceptional. And now the social license for that is waning. The community doesn't believe that and doesn't accept that anymore. But we are playing massive catch-up from a government perspective.
Okay, Fu, again, when can you pinpoint to a trust being lost? And is it just being eroded in time also because these technologies had so much advancement so quickly? I mean, the pace of change has been incredible over the last 10 years.
Yes, I think probably the single event is the Cambridge Analytica and the election manipulation that got a lot of people's attention. But to me, on the one hand, I think it's only tip of the iceberg. The type of manipulation that Cambridge Analytica has technologies to do is nothing like the new breakthroughs that are coming out. Right? There are new AI technologies that can target individuals with synthesized words and texts and language and speech and image and in the future video that are indistinguishable from human created. So this, this is deep fake on steroids. This is Cambridge Analytica on steroids. So on the one hand, I think the acceleration of technologies will make things worse, and we do have to get in front of the problem. But on the other hand, I don't think regulation alone is enough. If we look historically, every new technology has caused paranoia of some sort. So Y2K, there was electricity, electrocuting people, originally people concerned about the deaths and how it's used in the electrical chair. And then with internet connected to the PC, there were viruses, right, that were spreading everywhere. But in the end, it wasn't just regulation that solved the problems. It was the circuit breaker for the electrocution. It was the hard IT solutions for the Y2K. And it was the antivirus software. So I think we also need to encourage the technologists to not just work on the next breakthrough, but also work on practical problems that will help the regulators and the regulations in limiting the negative spread.
Does something like a deep fake also mean that citizens worry about how their data is used?
Deep fake, I think, is more about people being misled about falsehood, right? We've seen examples where famous politicians were put words in their mouths, speaking things that they didn't say. But that's really just the beginning, because in the future, this will become much more photorealistic. It will not just be a picture that's created. AI will be creating content that will influence people. It will know, someone who wants to influence an election could know what it is that it should synthesize in words, text, threats, images, and video that's not made by humans. It's made specifically targeting each individual on their deepest fears. So that, I think, is the concern for the future.
Yeah, Michael, you're MasterCard, right? So I don't use your products if I don't feel that I can trust your products. So what's your biggest challenge right now? Is it cyber attacks? Is it how you use data?
The point on data that we just has been kind of crystallizing as one of the key reasons for trust or a lack of trust is very much in focus. So if I don't know where my data is going, we just see this. People won't use digital technology. They will worry about an emerging payment technology, biometric checkout, for example. Who knows who has my facial data? So I'm worried about that. So the answer to that is, and a good answer is, waiting for regulation is potentially a long wait. So there is absolutely no reason for the private sector not to step up and say, I'm going to do something about it. So if you use our products, Francine, back when GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, came out of Europe, 2019, it's a good piece of legislation. We said, all right, that's great. Why is this limited to Europe? Why don't we just make it a global thing? Any other company could have done the same thing. We basically said 70 pages, 100 pages, whatever, of regulation translate to really one simple thing. It is your data. And you own it, and you benefit from it, and you control it. We put that out as a data principle statement, and we put it on a web page that you can actually access as a consumer, which for a B2B company is somewhat unusual. These are examples of what people can do to address that worry, because the worry is real. I think one other thing is really coming back to this point about unclear consent, tracking, when you get the cookie message, do I want to be tracked or not? Those are all things that I think in the context of data principles can be addressed. If a large social network would say, these are my data principles, so when I ask you this question, don't worry about it. Or do worry about it if somebody else asks you the question. So I think practical answers are there. If we address that, then we can go a lot further. And then regulation can kick in.
No.
And ideally, that goes in conjunction.
Minister?
Yeah, I think what Michael has just talked about is a very important attitude on the part of businesses. It's a question of whether you see this as not just a responsibility to your stakeholders, your customers, but really more from the point of view that it can be a competitive advantage. It is actually a very attractive proposition for you to be able to put forward to your customers to know that actually you take safety and security very seriously, and indeed you would design it into your systems. You wouldn't want to deliver them a service to them that is actually going to cause them harm. And this idea then, once it's baked into corporates, translates into a greater sense of responsibility, even in the use of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. Because from the customer standpoint, what goes on inside the delivery of the service to them is really a black box. It's very difficult for them to open up the box and say that they want to investigate every piece of it. Yeah. They simply do not have the ability to do so. And if corporates don't take this responsibility on themselves, and if the ecosystem doesn't find ways, to assure each other of this kind of responsibility, then I think over time, the level of trust will make people want to withdraw. And that's actually to all of our detriment.
Well, I'd argue that Twitter is a good example of that happening right before our eyes right now. And people are looking at what's happened, and they've said, Elon Musk has fired a bunch of those staff who their job is to stop the harm, to take down those tweets that are dangerous. They've changed the verification requirements. We were worried about people impersonating through artificial intelligence politicians. Well, all you need to do is pay and you can get a blue tick now. So there's a whole kind of monetarization of this fake accountability, fake authenticity. And I think that's the wrong end of the corporate responsibility. I think Michael is right that what we need to be doing is seeing business step up and say, this is the bar by which we all need to reach. And regulation is going to take time to catch up. But from a political perspective, from a public policy perspective, we need business there also standing up on a global level, across border, because this playing off of different regulations in different countries, I think, has lowered the bar and kept the bar low. I think the idea of a kind of coming together and a competition to do what is best and to do what is right, that's the only way you're going to keep the social license. And the community is already pulling back. They are worried about the data. And we need to make sure that they can understand, as you say, what they're signing up to. We talk about greenwashing in the environment space. What about privacy washing? What about this kind of bombardment of documents and consent? I think we've got to really deal with that. And government, that is something politicians can do, is they can say, and governments can say, here is some basic elements of how you inform and get consent from your consumers.
I mean, can I have a quick hands up of who reads the consent before actually, clicking on the button saying I consent? I mean, I don't have one hand up. There's not one hand up. I'm glad I feel less lonely. I just click. Kefi, this is something that I wanted to. So you were telling us before about the red flag at the start of automobiles, and I have some great questions from the audience. And this goes back a little bit to do chief executives have enough technical knowledge to make proper decisions on data privacy and cybersecurity? First of all, can you talk about what the red flag was?
Sure. Yeah, I think anytime there's new technology, it's understandable and natural for people, regulators and corporate executives alike, to think about the new technology only in the context of what they understood from the old traditional basis. So when automobiles were first introduced in the UK and also to a lesser extent in the US, people generally thought of automobiles as replacement for horses, so that laws were passed that says if you want to drive an automobile, then you need to have someone walk in front of the automobile, wave a red flag, so as to alert the horses. And also at night, you need a lantern. Well, that defeats the whole purpose of automobiles, right? So that, I think, is the danger of over-regulating without full understanding. And I think having understanding will be very helpful for the regulators to put the right proper controls in the system.
We could take that analogy a little bit further and say, and then governments ask the automobile industry to put in seatbelts. So, you don't have to take the cars off the road, but you do need to build safety into your design. And I think that is where we have to be pushing from, government perspective to industry. This needs to be built into your design, into your innovation.
As long as you understand.
As long as you understand.
That design. So as our chief executive,
I was going to say, I felt the question went to me,
I
actually.
know. I just want to get the red flag in. Do you feel like, or how much work do you need to do to make sure that you have the technical knowledge to understand these new threats that, frankly, are ever changing?
It's important to know, understand what is the promise of a particular technology. So if you're oblivious of that, it's obviously not helpful. So I used to be on the product side. That is helpful. But in the end, when it comes to topics like data responsibility, when it comes to topics like responsible artificial intelligence, avoiding biases that's built into technology, it's not just technology. I think the CEO today needs to be the person that can see that, but it can also see the aspect, what's the right thing to do? How do you apply it? Whose problem are you solving? So I think it needs a much, much broader background, but technology is needed because you might also overlook something. That is how we look at it. We are in technology. As a tech company, great. But we're not just a technology company, because in the end, it's an ecosystem that you're building. And that, you have the data principles in it. You have an inclusion aspect of it. So how do you pull people in? If you were just a tech company, would say, here's the next widget, that's all good. It has to be a lot more than that to become a sustainable ecosystem.
Minister, do you feel that some governments, maybe across the world, are concerned about over-regulating? This is another great question, for fear of losing their competitive advantage, even when it comes to data.
Well, I think it's been said very often that if you don't know what you're regulating, then you could end up doing more harm than good. And I think there is an element of truth in that. And so the investment of time to understand how the technology works, to my mind, is quite critical. You say, for example, what is the role that technology can play itself in trying to strengthen the safeguards? So if we are concerned about disinformation, we are concerned about harmful content. There is so much content on social media services that if you were to try and regulate on a piece-by-piece content, it will never work. You need to deploy artificial intelligence. You also need to deploy technology to do the content moderation. And in order to be able to set up rules that are going to be relevant and effective without engaging with the industry, without understanding how their specific technology works in each of those social media services, we are going to make no headway. So that's one element I think is very important. But even in trying to secure our systems, there is a role to play by artificial intelligence. The bad guys, as it were, will use AI to try and fool all of our systems of threat detection. You are trying to pick out images that, do facial recognition, right? And you want to make sure that these systems are not being exploited. But on the other side, the cyber criminals will precisely find some way of fooling your facial recognition system. And unless you also have access to technologies like AI to try and detect these kinds of methods, then you're not going to be able to make enough headway. So I would say that we have to have a healthy respect of the technology, understand what it can and cannot do, and then actually use the technology to our advantage. And the regulations have to attend to that understanding.
I think the minister's points are excellent. On the issue of social networks, we often think of them as not doing enough to block or stop harmful information. We have to realize that in doing so, they have a serious conflict, right? Because they're advertising funded. They want more eyeballs. So by over-limiting so-called fake news and controversial content and polarized content, they're hurting their earnings. So the corporate responsibility may be a very tough one to apply because these people, these social networks are also, they feel responsible to their shareholders, but then they're hurting the users to boost their revenue. So the question is, how do we get them to do the right things? Sometimes a social network company would make the argument, fake news is very hard to detect. You can't do it perfectly. But I don't think we should. I think we need to hold them accountable that just because you can't do it perfectly doesn't mean you don't do it at all. There are many ways in which you can give scores. When I was at Google, we had scores on relevance. It's not perfect. I mean, who can really determine if a search engine is perfectly relevant? But you can give it 70%, 72%, and track that it's improving. So I think holding the social networking companies accountable through control of their fake news and other metrics that are meaningful, and also I think potentially encouraging them to look at different business models. Because advertising model is fundamentally pitting the interests of the investors against the users. And a subscription model is much healthier. For example, we don't hear people complaining Netflix is full of fake news, right? Because if we don't like it, we don't pay for it.
Well,
however, Netflix is now doing advertising, so that may change.
Sarah, what are the skills you think needed in government, but also to run a business to tackle some of these issues?
I think a big part of the issue is this lack of understanding, and I see that quite a lot amongst the not just the policymakers, but the regulators themselves. So I think there needs to be an investment in not just communication, but actually we need to be seeing a freshening up of the skill base, actually, amongst our regulators, so that they do know what's coming up, what are the risks, and sharing that. I think globally, this issue is only going to be tackled across borders, and that is the big problem. And I think whether it's data usage, the advertising model, the tax base, there needs to be some proper heads at both a government kind of global level, but also a global corporate level to tackle this stuff. At the end of the day, what we're asking for is for people to do the right thing, for companies that are using technology to engage and to deliver services to consumers to do the right thing. You call them consumers, I call them voters. They're our community, and it only works because they know and they trust your product, and they want to know that politicians actually have their back as well. This accountability element is essential. Someone raised in one of the breakout sessions yesterday that the kind of penalty for misuse, for doing the wrong thing, needs to match the crime. And I think often what we've seen, and this is one of the reasons I think governments tend to be a little reluctant to put their toe in the water, is because when you're talking about a big global effort, how does one country's penalty of a few $1 million compare to the billions of dollars of profit that a big social media platform has got by doing the wrong thing or not doing the right thing, which is they're slightly different. Michael?
You're taking the conversation a little bit into the broader skill question. So what do we do about all of that? So there's the data issue that we talked about, driving trust or lack of. One other really important aspect is cybersecurity as such. So if, let's say, we're clear about a company's data principles. Great, I know where my data is going, but are they keeping it safe? Are they investing into it? Is the industry, is the ecosystem keeping the data safe? Is there enough investment into cybersecurity to be ahead of the next hacker's new idea? And here on the skills side, I think we are at significant risk in many countries around the world to have the cyber force that we need to defend against that. You know, I was struck by a data point in the United States. The United States currently has open, if I recall this correctly, 700,000 open positions in cyber. In May 2020, this was 465,000. So the issue is big, as you know, $10 trillion, as I mentioned earlier. We have these open positions. There is not enough people that are waking up in the morning and saying, we need to keep our ecosystem safe, and here's what we do. I think programmatic approaches, and here we come back to public and private sector. Private sector can step up and educate people and train people and all of that. Government can help to do the same thing. In the US, there's a dialogue right now on possibly having a national cyber academy. So if you look at what longstanding military academy is about, this is just another version of the Navy Academy or the Air Force Academy or something like that. I think those ideas we need to really drive cyber knowledge and cyber defense knowledge at large scales. That's the one thing that keeps me up at night is who's going to attack us? And with the best data principle, if I don't solve that, we have an issue, and we need the public sector for that as well.
What keeps you up at night, Minister?
Yeah. So to my mind, that's the right kind of focus.
Right.
I mean, there is something to be said about regulations. So for example, where cybersecurity is concerned, you can set standards. You can make certain requirements known to the businesses. And you can also have penalties. But the penalties are really, not intended, just to catch you, when something wrong has happened.
Right.
The penalties actually is intended to incentivize you to do something before a bad situation evolves.
Yeah.
So over-focusing on the penalties, I think, runs a certain risk as well, because what pleasure do we get in exerting a big fine if the data is still lost? If you have put all of your attention on just trying to manage the public relations aspect of a data breach. Far more important for you to invest upstream and tackle the issues that really matter. And in this case, it has to do with a lack of skilled professionals with deep enough knowledge as well as capabilities to counter the enormous industrial complex that has emerged with ransomware, with cybercrime. That whole ecosystem is driven primarily by money. It's incredibly lucrative. The returns on investments for scammers, the returns on investment for cyber criminals, the fact that they have made ransomware as a service, these are all the challenges that we have to overcome. And to overcome them, relying on regulations alone is not going to be enough. Corporates stepping up, and also, as governments, us investing in building up the capabilities in people, organizing capacity building programs, making sure that whether it is in the institutes of higher learning or amongst the existing workforce, we are helping people to acquire the skill sets to be effective in cyber defense. Those are all very important efforts that we should really be focusing our attention on. I should also add one more thing, that where cyber is concerned, as in many other issues in the digital domain, international cooperation is very important. I'm sure across borders, Michael has to deal with a variety of standards. Actually, some interoperability is helpful to him, and some understanding of our international community, of what is expected, will go a long way in supporting his efforts as a corporate.
But if we also look at the pace of change that we could see in the next 5 years, Kefli, can you give us a glimpse into the future? So you understand, you have a deep understanding of technologies, how they will evolve, and we need to talk about what's happening in 5 years if we're going to regulate them properly today.
Yeah. So on the troubles that we face today, I think we can see some technologies coming in the horizon to help with respect to protecting privacy data. There are new technologies that allow us to have our cake and eat it too. That you can use your data to improve the system, improve the AI, without leaking your data to anyone that doesn't need to see it. So new technologies like federated learning are accomplishing that. There are issues related to bias, but there are new technologies coming out that will check for AI models that to reduce bias as well. And I think I mentioned some of the ways to deal with potentially AI overshaping people's opinion, deep fake, and fake news. Those can be detected, not perfectly, but we need to push for that. It's a little bit like what the minister said. It's kind of a cat and mouse game, right? The bad guys will always come up with ways to create fake news, deep fake, scamming. But the good guys, I think with more resources and more compute, in a lot of the cases, it comes down to who has more compute power. Deep fake is a great example. If I'm faking, you're detecting, who wins really just depends on, assuming we both have good algorithms, only depends on who's got more compute power. So we need to unleash that capability. So that's dealing with today's issues. I feel technology can play a strong role and then work hand in hand with regulation, better business models, corporate self-governance, ESG. I think that's the 5 years. Beyond that, I quite worry about AI is now able to generate content. And that will be used by greedy people, by profit-seeking people, by bad people to shape people's minds with AI-created content. If you think, today, people are heavily influenced by whether it's TikTok videos or YouTube or what have you, Instagram, those are still created by people without targeting. And I think that capability, I think we need to get ahead of the game. In fact, when the OpenAI is the firm that first came out with these AI-generated content, when they released GPT-2 several years ago, they actually announced it early, and they said, look, this is going to create a lot of problems. We want to get this ahead of the game, so people are starting to develop solutions while these technologies are being unleashed. But that really didn't happen. I think all the AI researchers are creating larger and larger models that can do fake content or content that looks real without enough work being put on the controls.
If you look at, so let's put it very simplistically, the good against the bad, so the people that tried to scam you and the ones that tried to defend you, you talk about computing capabilities. Who has the advantage now, and who will have it in 5 years?
I think certainly the large internet companies have lots of compute, right? Who has the most compute is really Google, Facebook, and Amazon. So they can potentially deploy compute on that. But it again comes to the point of, if you're asking a social network to not only eliminate fake content, which reduces their usage and therefore advertising, and then you're asking them to use a lot of their compute power to detect the fake, which costs a lot of money, I think it's going to be tough for the social networks in this economic environment to do these altruistic things that are counter to their economic and success and rise of the stock price. So I think it's a little bit tough.
Michael, what will you focus your priority on in the next 12 months and then 5 years to make sure that actually the trust is rebuilt?
Right. With a more digital world right now, it's really focusing on the end user. So we're in the B2B space as MasterCard. About 3 billion people hold a MasterCard payment credential on a phone or in a piece of plastic. So what are their concerns? What are they doing? What have they learned in the last 2.5 years? And how do we make this intuitive, and simple. Today, in theory, there should be no trade-off between security and simplicity. Because if we make it so secure and people can ultimately trust it, but it doesn't work, that's a problem on the other side of the equation. So that's where a lot of our focus goes. Trusted solutions at scale. That's the other issue. Put it out at scale. Back to the problem of access. If you're out of this digital economy that we just spent 40 minutes to discuss, that's a real issue as well. For us, that's long-term market building, financial inclusion, pulling people in. And then one other thing, really important. I just did I'm on a rather long trip, and I spent some time in Japan. And there was very much of a concern around the elderly population. What do they do in this kind of digital environment? How do we take them by the hand? So really understanding who's the end user, who do we need to help find the trust and not make it more complex.
Sarah, your priority over the next 12 months and then 5 years?
I think the privacy issue is crucial here, and people understanding what their rights are and understanding that the data is theirs, as you say, and almost giving them the power to demand that of the social media platform or the company that they're engaging with. I think that's essential. But look, there are parts and areas where countries are embarking on regulation, and I think we need to try and have as much international cooperation as possible, and that has to be a priority.
Minister?
I would say 3 things. One is inclusion. We've reached a point where the awareness, of digital is very strong, but people are becoming distrustful of it. So if we want to continue to encourage them to be involved in digital, we have to teach them to build the confidence. Otherwise, they will exclude themselves, and I think we are all the worse for it. Second, I would say, is that we need thoughtful regulation. It's like, in the physical world, it took us years to be able to, develop safety codes for buildings, for fire, and it didn't happen overnight. In digital, we don't quite have all the equivalent building blocks yet to assure people that it's safe to use. So thoughtful regulations, I think, will still need to be priority. Thirdly, I would say international cooperation. Many of the problems in digital cannot be solved by a government alone. And unless we achieve an understanding with our colleagues how to go about addressing issues regarding data flows, how to address issues surrounding different standards for all kinds of systems that companies have to build, we will be very much impeded in its progress. So I would say these 3 things.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for a very thoughtful and robust conversation.
Please welcome our panellists, Board Chair and Chief Executive Officer of Cargill, David McLennan. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Grow Intelligence, Sarah Menker. Chief Executive Officer of Regrow Ag, Anastasia Volkova. And our moderator, anchor for Bloomberg Television, Sherry Ahn.
Thank you all for joining us today. I mean, it's such a perfect time to have this conversation, right? I mean, we woke up to the news of the rocket hitting Poland, and then we saw grain prices soaring at a time when, of course, food insecurity has been rising around the world. And this begs the question, let's dive directly and immediately into it. Sarah, are we on the verge of a food crisis, or are we already in one?
Yeah, I think we've been in one for a while now. So the conversation of a verge has sort of long sailed. And, you know, much of what we're seeing today is a function of issues and things that were brewing for years leading up to where we are now. And so, you know, the war is really adding fuel to an already burning fire as opposed to having created it. And a lot of these changes that we've experienced in our food systems really started 2 to 3 years ago, where structural demand changes had occurred in places like China, which became a net importer of grain for the first time. And then you've had sort of an unprecedented number of supply-side disruptions, both sort of climate-induced as well as COVID-induced. And so those became the impetus for what was a food crisis before the war, and the war just made it that much worse. And so, you know, really when we think about sort of the price of food and where it started, we really think about it in the context of the start of 2020, right, when everybody was so focused on sort of lockdowns, these changes were already well underway.
And the war in Ukraine just making things worse. And Anastasia, you're actually from Ukraine. Give us some of your personal perspective on what's happening there, and also how sort of it relates to the stresses that we're seeing in the global food system.
I think generally, as a Ukrainian, it's hard to imagine your country becoming so famous for something so unfortunate so quickly. But on the other hand, I think Ukrainians, as you can see, are very brave people that understand that they live and steward the breadbasket of the world. And I think there's a lot of hindrances that could be removed for us to actually release some of the pressure on the food crisis, because Ukraine is producing, it has deep soils, it has not been in the climate crisis like many other producing regions. And if we can get a better diplomacy to have a better visibility or control over the actual export from Ukraine, I think this would be a very welcome step forward, because Ukrainians are producing, even though they had not one of the best harvests and under all of the pressure of the war, they're resilient and they keep pushing and they've been brave producing the food.
The November 19 deadline is coming up on allowing exports from Ukraine. Do you think it will be renewed now?
It's so hard to know. Like we were talking with David about what will actually happen after having all of these contradictory announcements that almost not thought through. So it's hard to say that and answer this question very directly, but I would say so many depend on it. I hope it doesn't happen, and I hope we have enough diplomacy and willpower to actually not let it happen.
Dave?
Yeah, anytime food should not be used as a weapon. And to the points that both Anastasia and Sarah made, I mean, it's a very fraught situation. The November 19th date, which is Saturday, is being watched. And you saw about 2 weeks ago when Putin announced that he was not going to renew it, what it did to food prices. And they said, well, maybe we will renew it, and food prices, ag prices, crop prices came back down. But I think it's this convergence of, as Sarah was saying, climate change, supply chain disruptions, geopolitical stress, which is all adding to very tense moments in ag markets and food prices.
And Cargill is in so many different parts of the food system and the food chain, right? So where are you seeing the biggest stresses at this point?
Well, certainly it has to start with Ukraine and Russia, and that's such a breadbasket of the world relative to corn, wheat, and sunflower production. And so the world is dependent, many parts of the world are dependent on that. Sarah was also saying impacts of COVID and climate change and things like hurricanes hitting the Gulf of Mexico. Even most recently, with decreasing water levels in the Mississippi River, you know, the farmers and companies like Cargill were not able to get crops down the river until recently. There's been more rain, there's been increasing levels, increasing dredging in the Mississippi, but the impacts of climate change, geopolitics, supply chain disruptions are profound, but that's one that, you know, in the short term, it's more difficult to predict and difficult to control. for example, the impact of severe and extreme weather events on getting food from where it's produced to where it's needed.
Does that mean food prices will be higher next year?
Not necessarily, but certainly, as I was saying, the supply and demand stocks, particularly in oil seeds, are very tight. And all it takes is one really bad crop, and say in North America or South America, to really send prices higher. So farming is an outdoor sport, and we rely on farmers, and that's where it all begins, but we rely on the weather, and that's something from year to year we're not really sure about.
And that's the thing, right? Just a couple of years ago, we've been talking about the supply chain disruptions and how perhaps rising food prices is really a result of distribution issues. How much of it is a production issue now in East Asia?
I think we've moved from solving for the supply chain issues to really have little control over production issues. And we have in our toolbox the ability to change the system and uncorrelate it from inputs like gas, like urea prices of fertilizer, but we need to deliberately invest in it to do so. So I think right now the blockers are definitely on the production side, with the climate hitting simultaneously several production regions of the world.
Sarah, you've been also looking at fertilizer prices just soaring.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, well, fertilizer is a whole other complication in terms of input because, you know, basically on top of climate, you also need sort of nutrients for your plants. And the price of fertilizer over the last couple of years has quadrupled. Nitrogen shortages and gas prices in Europe have curbed production, and so therefore created major stresses in terms of fertilizer availability, not just affordability around the world. You have both an affordability problem as well as a brewing potential availability problem. And you know, we had done an analysis and a sort of an open source study in partnership with 400 fertilizer companies, essentially looking at what the demand of nitrogen-based fertilizers was set to be for the world, for every part of the world, and what that would mean for yield and for production, given certain scenarios. I will say that the worst case scenario that was painted in June, we're now worse than the worst case scenario. And if you look at what that means for production in corn, in rice, in wheat, sort of in the 2022 and 2023 year, you're looking at an overall reduction of 2.5%, which is not inconsequential, given what Dave mentioned in terms of inventory levels already being low. So if we had healthy inventory levels, you're in a different place. But when you look at overall inventories, really for grains and oil seeds, you're at, you know, multi sort of decade lows. So you're in hairy territory.
And add to that the challenge that we're now competing for these foods with sustainable aviation industries, biofuels, that sector and how it interlinks with food and the agricultural system. Dave, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's many people will recall, let's say 20 years ago when the ethanol industry, the corn ethanol industry was taking off, and there was a big debate, a big dynamic of, okay, food or fuel, where is it going to go, into your tank or into your stomach or the stomach of animals that are being fed? There's a similar dynamic today, which is emerging because of focus on sustainability by consumer companies, retailers, companies like Cargill farmers to grow more sustainably produced crops. It is also because of the advances in technology which will allow us to make products like sustainable aviation fuel or biodiesel in greater scale and greater quantity than, say, 20 years ago. We don't think that it's going to be an either-or dynamic. It can be food and fuel. It doesn't mean it has to go one place or the other, but it's also going to then go back to the farmer in terms of regenerative agriculture practices, greater yields, greater use of technology to be able to increase production so that it can go into food as well as fuel.
Regenerative agriculture is something that you're trying to scale up at Regrow. Tell us a little bit about why this is important, especially because there's this dichotomy when it comes to food that it's really suffering from climate change, but it's also a huge contributor to greenhouse gas emissions.
And to add to that, we may not see food as a solution, and agriculture is one of the hard-to-abate industries, may not be seen as actually the solution to invest in, but it is. And this is a solution that is the most ready solution, not to criticize, but not direct air capture, that at scale does 4 tons of CO2 equivalents a year. Agriculture, that at scale does hundreds of millions of acres across U.S. alone, each of which has at least the potential of 1/3 of a ton, 1/2 of a ton. This is something that is very real. And the way that the introduction of regenerative agriculture solution will actually reduce some of the pressures on the climate and the economy, whilst, of course, introducing more demand for investment into that decorrelatory change that we need to see, is the reduction in fertilizer prices that Sarah spoke, not prices, the demand for fertilizer that has such a high price. You're able to have a more circular system if you are regenerative. You're not so dependent on synthetic inputs, which allows you to produce in a way that's more decorrelated and be even more resilient as an enterprise on the farming scale to impact the community and actually be seen as part of the solution, which agriculture for such a long time has been alienated from.
Cargill actually has a big commitment on this field as well. Why is that important to a company like yours?
Well, I think Anastasia makes an important point, and she's right that agriculture is being increasingly either blamed or focused upon as a emitter of greenhouse gas emissions or being unsustainable. And the fact is, yes, the ag industry does use a lot of resources. Water produces greenhouse gas emissions, but again, to Anastasia's point, ag is how we can find the solution. Agriculture has to be part of the solution, and it has to start with the farmers. And whether it's more sustainable farming methods or raising cattle in more sustainable ways or using regenerative agriculture practices. So we partner with Regrow Ag to help farmers measure the impact on regenerative agriculture to see what is happening to carbon in the soil, so carbon sequestration, so we have verifiable results. But that's where it has to begin, is at the front end of the food supply chain with the farmers.
Sarah, how important is getting actually the good data, the right data out there, and really being able to measure the accomplishments in this field in order to make progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think data is going to be critical for scaling regenerative ag because it's, with any innovation, it's always a journey, right? And that journey means defining the metrics that matter and then standardizing those metrics at scale so that we're comparing apples to apples. And as this sort of process is ongoing right now, companies like Regrow Ag are actually going to be really important and critical to defining what these metrics are going to be at the farm level to be able to then say, how do we do it? Because I think one of the biggest lessons in sort of what we're seeing in the ESG space in general is that definition process, that hard work of defining and standardizing didn't happen up front, and now we're paying the price for it because everybody was sort of doing their own thing, defining it as they please, and the way I sort of described it was, it was not an asset class, it's a lens, and everybody's wearing different glasses. We need to make sure that in sort of regenerative agriculture, we don't go down that journey. And so I think data is going to be sort of the critical component, and industry coming together to define what that is going to be key.
That is so important at a time when we have a growing population and rising demand for proteins as well, right? How does Cargill deal with that, and how do innovative technologies play into that as well?
Well, if you think about the evolution of agriculture, particularly in the last, say, 5 years, but even I'm thinking going back to the history of Cargill, 157 years old, let's say 20 years ago, it was about buying products from farmers, putting it on rail, train, barge, ocean-going freight, and getting it to where it's needed. Now, if you think about the trends in ag to technology and innovation, I mean, look at these two companies that are represented by entrepreneurs that started these companies that provide data, provide technology to help farmers be more productive, help them be more sustainable. This is a new evolution. There's a statistic, and I'll get it directionally wrong, but you'll get my point. In 2013, there's about $2 billion of investment capital going into agriculture. Today, it's over $30 billion. So innovation in terms of technology, the ability to produce more sustainable crops, and the partnership of traditional agriculture and food companies with startup new technology companies, that's how we're going to have more sustainably produced agriculture. The partnership between farmers and agricultural merchandisers and handlers and technology companies, that's how we're going to get better.
Regrow is doing exactly that. How are you partnering with companies? Not to mention, what do you expect the bigger role of private sector to be as we make progress in this field?
Absolutely. Ambassador Tai alluded to this yesterday when she was saying private sector is actually leading in this area. It's leading in adoption of sustainability because to private sector, the cost is very high. The supply chain disruptions are very real. The products will not be on shelves. They will not even be produced. The product will not even hit the mill. This is a very real risk against which the private business is hedging. And at Regrow, we're privileged to work with leaders in this space who understand and are ready to invest in it with their global supply sheds, really getting this data, the visibility into what does the adoption look like now for regenerative practices, what is the potential, where should we invest now, and most importantly, how do we move the needle, because we need early successes. We need to invest now. There's a solution to this problem, it is available, and we need to act now.
Sarah, what about governments? Because we have seen as prices rise, more and more administrations are trying to close their doors. And we're talking about even here in Asia, India, Malaysia, really restricting those food exports.
Yeah, you know, with good intention, knee-jerk reactions by government tend to be sort of the biggest market movers than sort of the markets themselves, right? And I think this wave of protectionism that we are experiencing as a world, not just in agriculture, but across industries, right? Like, I think the recognition that much of sort of what we all view as sort of globalization changing in front of our eyes includes in our food systems becoming a major part of it. And it is actually one of the hardest things to deglobalize. Because outside of the United States, there are not that many countries that can actually produce 100% of their supply chain needs, everything from fertilizer all the way to sort of, you know, your entire stack of sort of what food is to make it work. And what happens right now is, as inflationary pressures have played out across the world, you know, each country tends to have an overall competitive advantage in exporting one or two major products. The knee-jerk reaction becomes to ban the export of that product when the inflationary pressures tend to be coming from products that you're importing, not the products you're exporting. And those products you're exporting are actually products that generate dollar-based reserves at a time when the dollar is strengthening and you need the dollar. So it actually fuels the inflation further. And so I think thinking systematically about, and this has been some of the hard work we've been doing as a company, is sort of saying, how do we put self-interest aside and actually see how it is a trading-based economy, and how do we sort of optimize our trade flows and our trading systems, and how do we recreate sort of the structure of the future, because a world where every country believes it should produce what it needs, you have not seen inflation yet. And I think that is where the challenge is.
David Cargill operates in more than 70 countries globally, right? What do you make of that? Plus the latest comments that we're getting from the G20 from Russia's side that a lot of the food inflation actually comes from sanctions against them because of the invasion of Ukraine. And even going as far as saying, is Western food companies, perhaps yourself as well, that's actually adding to inflationary concerns?
Well, Sarah's right. I mean, the world depends on an interconnected food system in order to have not only availability, accessibility, but relative price stability as well. And so there's comparative advantage. There are a few countries, Sarah said it, that can produce everything they need. We've got to rely on open borders. We've got to rely on trade. And any time that you have disruption due to either geopolitical conflict, like what we're seeing in Ukraine, or trade barriers, like what we saw between the U.S. and China several years ago, you're going to see a spike in prices. It is not natural instincts of political leaders when there are shortages or inflation, they want to make sure they have enough food for their own country. But that's the worst thing you can do, even though it feels, I got to keep food at home. People have got to eat. When they don't eat, they get hungry. When they get hungry, bad things happen, for obvious. But
what about the criticism that
Yeah.
Western food companies are taking advantage of the crisis right now?
I don't know what logic that is based on. Certainly, Western food companies, our mission is to nourish the world, to make sure food gets to where it's needed. The corridor being open has been a big relief since the invasion of Ukraine back in February, but I'm not sure where that thinking would come from, that there's some type of Western food conspiracy to make sure the food doesn't get to people where it's needed.
But companies have benefited a lot during this time.
I mean, we've done our job, and we've gotten food from where it's produced to where it's needed. We've managed through volatility. We've managed through supply chain disruptions. I think the world's food workers have shown the resilience of the system. And when you think about debates of who's going in the office and who's going to work from home, food workers, farmers, they're there every day. That's how the world has continued the world food system has worked in the last 2 years.
Are you actually seeing some of that labor shortage also affecting, perhaps contributing to the inflationary pressures?
For sure. So not only with COVID disruptions, but also with labor shortages and migration of people from work one industry to another. But certainly in our meat business in the U.S. in particular, we've had significant labor shortages, which have added to production scale backs because we don't have the labor to staff the plants.
Anastasia, what will it take to have sustainably lower prices, to ease this food inflation that's really making a lot of people go hungry, especially in developing and emerging economies?
It would take three things. It would take collaboration, and I know it's a frequently used word, but as a supply chain, everyone who's supporting ag supply chains, including governments that have the wrong type of knee-jerk reaction, they have to collaborate in a way that is systems thinking forward. The companies across the supply chain must collaborate and co-invest, which is what we're lacking right now, which is my next point. We need, apart from collaboration, we need investment, forward investment at the time that is very hard to justify, but it's only going to get harder. We need to justify this now. And being able to really have a global view of the resilient supply chain. It is, by definition, as Sarah was saying, a global system in which it's optimized for resilient production. If you have a hurricane in the north, maybe you have better production in the south. If you have a drought in the south, you have production in the north. We are an interconnected system that's getting out of balance because of climate change very quickly. And if we start actually separating the cabins in this big ship, we're going to actually sink faster. So it is through collaboration, forward investment, and the global view of the resilient system that we need to solve this.
Sarah, what do we need?
Magic bullet. I mean, I think in terms of thinking about developing countries in general, I think multilateral institutions are not where they need to be, I think, on this issue. They've been slow to reacting. They need to be faster. And because, the reality is that just the balance sheets of countries are very weak right now. And the combination of rising food prices and a strengthening dollar has meant that the domestic price of food in certain parts of the world, I mean, when we talk about sort of the price of wheat, we're just looking at a futures price as opposed to the domestic price. And when you look at the basket of sort of foods consumed around the world and you look at what the price change has been over sort of the last 2 years, in the US, it's up about 66%. In Sudan, it's up 1,900%. In Syria, it's up 700%. In Turkey, it's up 400%. These numbers are not small. Ethiopia, it's 200%. So when you look at sort of what these pressures are, it's a combination of food prices and a strengthening dollar that is really making things extremely complicated for sort of the global economy. And there are only certain actors or certain institutions we currently have in place that can address that, which is some of these multilateral institutions. Private companies just can't step in and address these challenges. And I think having those institutions step up and step into the roles for what they were created, or reshaping them to be what the world needs sort of going forward, I think is going to be a critical part of this equation.
Dave, what do you think, and is there space for collaboration between the private and public sector to fill that gap?
For sure there is. And as I was just talking about collaboration or partnerships with companies like Sarah and Anastasia's, but also it has to be in partnership with governments. I think the U.S. Department of Agriculture has done a great job of supporting agriculture production. They just recently made several grants to innovative food systems and sustainably produced food systems. So I think we're seeing more of an active role, not only from the U.S. government, but other governments. It has to be there. It has to be the traditional public-private partnership that gets us forward.
One quick round of questions. Will food prices be higher or lower next year?
I think they will. I think they will be lower. I think that we'll find that we'll find ways to continue to move food to where it's needed, and I'm going to choose to be optimistic that there will be some resolution to some of the conflicts that are going on that's disrupting the supply chain.
Sarah?
There's a saying that says the cure to high prices is high prices, which is at some point there will be demand destruction. We haven't seen that demand destruction, but there is a tipping point at which people just can't afford it, and so you'll start to see demand destruction. And so I'll actually go with Dave and be optimistic on this one. There are certainly concerns, but they can't continue to rise, and at least we're going to have to see a demand response. We haven't seen it yet, but I think that response will come.
Anastasia?
I think it's been said. I want to lull us into the safety zone. I think we're very far from actually making it happen. A lot of action is required. But I'm with Sarah and Dave that this is possible and we need to make it happen.
With fingers crossed and with an optimistic tone, we end this conversation. Thank you guys so much for this.
Thank you.
Please welcome our panellists, Co-Chief Executive Officer of Investcorp, Hazem Ben Gassam, Chief Executive Officer of Fidelity International, Anne Richards, Group Chief Executive of Standard Chartered, Bill Winters, Founder, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Hill House Investments, Lei Zhang, and our moderator, Senior Executive Editor for Bloomberg News, Sarah Wells.
Right, thank you and hello. When it comes to financing the new economy, there are no shortage of large numbers to throw around. I think we've all heard the $100 trillion figure for net zero. Then we can layer on, building more resilient supply chains, new tech stacks to digitize businesses, other aspects of ESG, and on and on. But our panelists today represent some of the biggest names in public and private market investing, as well as banking. So they're all going to play a key part in getting us there. So let's dive straight in. Lei, I might start with you. You said previously that your investment philosophy can be boiled down to doing things that make sense. And you raised $18 billion last year, so that gives you a lot of room to do things. What new economy investments do you think make the most sense, i.e. where are you actively looking to allocate capital?
Sure, absolutely. If you look at the whole climate technology space, particularly on the supply chain, I think there's a lot to do. And we are pretty excited. Earlier in the breakout session, we talked about the technology and innovation that can really drive down the cost. You look at the solar industry in the last 10 years, essentially drive down the unit cost by 90%. We expect another 50% down in the next 10 years. Similarly, you could see that happening in the solar, in the battery storage. So we think there's a lot we can do as private investors, as the government working together to help with that supply chain, help with that technology, help with the innovation.
All right, and I might come to you next to talk around how you balance your fiduciary duties to investors, i.e. to maximize returns, make as much money as possible, relative to the broader principle of sustainability and sustainable investing. And I ask this in particular because ESG investing as a concept is coming under increasing criticism in the US, excuse me, and investments in fossil fuels are rising again. So I guess I would ask, is the sustainable investing movement losing momentum?
I think you can clearly see that we're dealing with a very different set of external dynamics to the ones we were dealing with, at the last COP26 in Glasgow last year. And as fiduciaries, our role is really to look after other people's money, our clients' money, in the way that they want us to. And what we have seen is some differentiation, depending on where you are in the world, about what people think is the right thing to do in order to exercise that fiduciary responsibility. But we've certainly, within our client base, we've not seen any let-up in momentum in terms of their desire to make sure that the fiduciary responsibilities that they give us, that we act on their behalf, include thinking about how the investments they make are sustainable over the longer term and not just profit maximizing in the short term. So, I think there can be differences in time horizon about the way you measure those financial returns, but I think at the heart of it, investments, companies that are exploitative, for example, of the environment, we know that over the long run, those will, and it might be the very long run, but those will deliver lower returns. So it's more a question of a balance of timing than it is, I think, of financial returns versus sustainability. And certainly the broad base of our clients would support that, albeit there are slightly different nuances in different parts of the world, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And what are those nuances?
Sorry?
What are those nuances?
Well, in the US, clearly, you have had some... it is a minority of the client base, but nonetheless some of the client base thinking that the fiduciary responsibility should be to maximize financial returns, which is fair enough. That doesn't mean that you can't have a sustainability objective alongside that, but nonetheless that there is a primacy of financial returns. It's very, very clear from our European client base that they regard sustainability as an absolutely inherent part of delivering long-term financial returns. So, it is quite, there are those nuances. By the way, there are US investors who would agree with that. So it's quite an interesting dynamic. And here in Asia, I think in Asia, the part of sustainability that really, I think, very much increasing is that environmental, is that climate-related part of the sustainability agenda. And we're seeing an increase in our clients here in Asia talking to us about what is the right way to reflect their concerns in the portfolios that we build for them. So I think, if you just break it up into those three regional blocks, you are seeing, some differences in approach, but the overall momentum, at least from what we see in our client base, is broadly unchanged.
So Sarah, if I can add to that point, I think whether we are an investor or a restaurant owner or a minister or a taxi driver, we need to conduct ourselves as a responsible human being, period. That responsibility shouldn't be a question mark of returns. If we want to generate high returns, I think we can all go on the cocaine trade and probably make significantly more than what we were making, but we don't. Why? Because we're responsible beyond the legal requirement. And I think that principle of being a responsible human being needs to be carried in every single sector and in every single, if we are investors, we got to act responsibly. Now, perhaps there are some extreme interpretations of ESG, but I think if we all start with that principle of we're going to do what is right as a human being, as a responsible person on this planet, to our families, to our children, what have you, then I think we should be fine. And I think that principle, I don't think anyone will disagree with. But perhaps some interpretations of what does ESG investing stand for is perhaps have gone far. And I'm going to use the example of fossil fuel. Mm-hmm. I, for one, I'm so thankful for the fossil fuel industry in the last 150 years that it has gotten us to where we are today. That is the reality. If it wasn't for the fossil fuel industry, I think the world wouldn't be where it is today. Now, but again, as humans, we evolve, and that technology is becoming more and more obsolete. The same way a steam engine became obsolete, and more now the combustion engine is becoming obsolete, and other technologies are evolving. But it shouldn't be vilified in a manner which is perhaps unfair. And we humans, we have evolved, and that journey, we learn from it. And I hope this journey from fossil fuel to renewable energy will happen in that manner. But it needs to be a transition as opposed to something which you have to stop right now and you're going to be vilified if you do put a penny into fossil fuel and what have you.
Bill, I'd like to pick that up from a banking perspective. I understand from a brief discussion backstage that you may dispute this figure, but I have seen statistics showing that bank lending to fossil fuel companies is up about 15% in the first 9 months of this year, to more than $300 billion. So are you concerned about the level of commitment across the banking system to net zero?
I'm concerned about the world's commitment to net zero, because I think everybody is finding it hard, both technically and financially. But I take a look at Standard Chartered Bank. We've increased our loans to organizations like Saudi Aramco and British Petroleum. Why? We're financing a green hydrogen project in Saudi Arabia. We're financing billions of dollars of renewables that are being funded and technically driven by the big fossil fuel producers and carbon emitters. They're trying to do the right thing, obviously completely subscribe to the transition theory and reality, because we can't get off fossil fuels today. We can redeploy that cash flow into the most socially useful thing that we can, and that's quite natural for energy companies to diversify into renewables. So I think one of the big problems we've got right now is that the investment into fossil fuel production has plummeted, including oil and gas. Obviously, coal has decreased significantly. Coal is unnecessary, and I think the International Energy Agency has been very clear that new coal production is unnecessary to satisfy world demand. Unfortunately, ongoing development of oil and gas is necessary unless we're going to stifle the opportunity for, in particular, developing economies to grow. It's the only access to energy that they've got, and these economies are still growing, many of them in this neighborhood right here. So that part of the transition, and it's part of the transition that we're financing, is to go from the dirtiest fuels to the cleaner fuels and then to renewables. Sometimes you can leapfrog straight there, but there's just not enough solar. I mean, it's wonderful, the picture of I think that's the project we financed in Indonesia, with floating solar farm in Java. And that's great. But there are as many solar cells being produced right now as can be installed. We can go faster over time, not that much faster. And the banking industry will finance that. There's not much investment going into fossil fuel production, and that's leading to structurally higher prices. If you're a coal producer right now, you are minting money, right? Why? Because there's been no new investment in coal. The price of coal is 4 times what it was 3 years ago, and they're generating grotesque profits. Now, should those companies be diverting that cash flow into renewables? Yeah, they should. In some cases, they are, but not consistently. And that's one of the big opportunities that we've got.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying, on balance, the responsible thing to do right now is allocate more to fossil fuels?
No. The responsible thing to do right now is to allocate more and more into transition finance. Mm-hmm. And that's the $300 billion that Standard Chartered is committed to delivering into transition finance. But that transition will be moving from the dirtiest forms of fuel to ever cleaner forms of fuel, eventually to purely renewable power.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, if I can come in on that as well, because I think it's a really important point. If you look out to 2050, 2060, there is pretty broad agreement at a political level of what the direction of travel is and what the aspiration is that we need to get to in roughly that time frame. The challenge for all of us is there are multiple different paths to get there, and you have to figure out what the consequences of those different paths are. So even on the subject of thermal coal, and we've set ourselves targets of how we want to really help the firms we invest in get completely away from thermal coal. If you're sitting in a developing country where your only local source, cheap source of energy is thermal coal, well, there's a duty on everybody else to help find alternatives to that. Otherwise, the economically sensible thing for minimizing harm to your local population, who will otherwise be in fuel poverty, is just to exploit the thermal coal. So we've got to figure out what is the optimal path. And there is more than one of those, potentially, but we've got to get on that path and accept it's not going to go in a straight line. And, you've seen from the events this year and the dislocation in energy markets, fuel poverty has become very real for a lot more people. And that's something that we We can't just ignore in a straight line drive to 2050. We've got to figure out the very difficult way of navigating what are a set of difficult trade-offs, and how do we make them in a way that's fair and proportionate, but nonetheless gets to where we need to get to in 2050.
I want to switch tack slightly now, because we've been talking about what to do with capital. I'd also like to talk around where some of that capital will come from. So maybe, Hazem, a question for you. What role do you think private wealth will play in financing the new economy? And also, what does that do to risk appetite?
Yeah.
Does it change the equation?
Yeah. So we as a firm for now 4 decades, an anchor part of our capital into alternative investments came from private wealth. Let me just throw some numbers out there first. Today, private wealth accounts for about 120 trillion globally. But here's the interesting fact. 60 trillion out of that 120 over the next 30 to 40 years is going to transition to the next generation. So how are these lucky bunch? They're usually between the age of 30 and 50. They tend to be higher on the risk profile than their prior generation, which means they have a higher appetite, not for bonds, not for T-bills, but perhaps experiment with private equity, with venture capital, with new territories which they haven't been exposed to in the past. I think the days where I made some money, I put it with a mutual fund, or I put it with my asset manager, perhaps are going to evolve in an interesting way. Now we see this live with our clients. The profile of them tends to be they ask a lot of questions, and they kind of know it all, in terms of kind of risks, and Indonesia, great place, we should be there, kind of Vietnam, be careful. So, and that's fine. But also the very interesting aspect about them is they're very, very digitally savvy. And sometimes they prefer less to come to a wood-paneled office and sitting in front of the financial manager to tell about the portfolio, and more, show me the app. And you know what, I want to see little videos of the CEOs of these 2 businesses you bought, and let me make the decision how much I'm going to allocate here and there. So I think digitization will play a very, very important part in the future of capital, particularly going into the private markets, which we kind of know. And that new generation is more vocal. And last thing I should say is that new generation is very, very clear on using their capital to support whatever concepts they believe in or principles they feel strongly about. And I think that probably will be the biggest push in favor of the renewable energy kind of marketplace, I think, because that's a big portion of that 120 trillion will be in the hands of individuals who have strong views about the environment, around the future, around D&I, around what proper firms should be looking at. And that's great. I think that democratization of private markets is perhaps a healthy evolution in the future.
If I could add on that, I wonder whether would a better designed products with renewable for private wealth actually for our institutions could be possible. I was thinking about sort of exchange-based infrastructure risk products and things like that gives some stability, but also help build on the sort of the renewable infrastructure that Bill and Ann talked about, because you really think about the investing in the whole space. It's not only about technology and supply chain, it's a lot about debottlenecking that whole logistics, port, facilities, infrastructure around that. I think that if we could work on some products, I don't know, put on some bank leverage or something for private wealth, put some economic incentive for them, but well-design something good for the industry. And a second thought on this would be sort of the soft infrastructure around the whole green financing, that we've been looking for more sort of data-driven analytical measurement, sort of more dynamic measurement companies, businesses that could say, hey, this is the standard we are using, but it's not a static standard. So it's pulling all the data, has algorithm working on this rating agency. It's a set of the whole infrastructure is needed for this. And so that's second part. And lastly, the final part of whole green investments is on this education. I think that, you think about this new labor force has to be put in place. And I'm not sure the current educational system is that productive in terms of bringing the newest technology, newest skill sets, particularly on the vocational schools. That I'm not talking about university level or advanced labs. I'm really talking about, solar installation agents or that the workers and doing your battery exchange. And that was earlier hearing people telling me how much time they have to wait just and even in the winter for them to switch on a new battery storage or inverter or getting the solar installed. So I think having that, I'm looking at some technology helping that. I'm looking at some vocational school run by private entrepreneurs. I think those are really promising. I look at it. So one of actually a tech portfolio company that we have is really interesting. What they do is that they try to sort of break down all the knowledge of installation and services into 30 seconds TikTok video. It's like you just swipe it yourself, and after you do that, actually you look at your camera and you do a recording, and the phone gonna listen using AI whether you have the right keywords or whether you're smiling. So I think having that sort of vocational training, helping bring up the skill sets. For the soft infrastructure.
Human capital is a huge part of this equation.
It's a huge deal.
Can I come back to your earlier comment on private wealth, though? Because obviously Hill House currently raises funds from institutional investors. Were you implying that you'd like to find a way to also target private wealth clients? Or is that not feasible right now?
No, absolutely. We'd love to. I think we just need to find the really, sort of the right products that I think that's relevant, that we can serve well, and we can really build in that capabilities. Yes, definitely.
Okay. And I'd like to situate this discussion of how to finance the new economy in the context of some of the other current economic challenges that we are facing. Obviously, we've talked a lot at the forum so far about interest rates rapidly rising, recession risks, and also the risks of decoupling, of the creation of economic blocs led by the US and China. And I think that risk remains despite the green shoot of Monday's Xi-Biden meeting. So Bill, as a global bank, with a significant China-facing business, how do you think about the decoupling issue? Over the long term, I guess, how comfortable will the West be in financing China and China-led projects?
So I'm also encouraged by that green shoot that you mentioned. I think it's certainly a sign that there's a will not to have things get worse, and we were concerned about the perpetual escalation cycle. But certainly President Biden was very clear this is going to be intense competition for a long time. But our economies are also incredibly intertwined. So the idea that we could decouple was never really very practical, and it would have been extremely costly to both sides. So I don't think we ever thought that was a likely outcome. But there's always the possibility of an accident or a misjudgment. Perhaps there was
or decoupling in specific sectors, right? Like what we're seeing with chips.
I think the focus on national security considerations and supply chain security considerations, that's structural. We've had a massive change. We know that that's going to affect the way supply chains work around the world. We know that that's structurally inflationary, and that's, I think, one of the big challenges that central banks have right now, but that's a different discussion. The period of intense competition, from our perspective, is fine. We actually love competition because it makes everybody up their game. It makes everybody a little bit better. China is opening up. They're opening up very fast. The reason that our profits in China, despite all this COVID stuff, are up 30% year on year is because China's opening up. And that's going to keep on going. And China is going to take steps to make the RMB a more interesting currency in which to conduct trade, including digital versions, fiat versions, cross-border arrangements like the M-Bridge or with Hong Kong, China, Thailand, and the UAE, which will be expanded further, I'm sure, once they get it working. And that will actually increase the interconnectedness between, call it East and West, although a lot of the interesting relationships are obviously in the East with Korea and Japan, for starters. And that, so I'm quite optimistic about the return to structural growth in China. Obviously, they have to put the COVID restrictions behind them. They think they've also, the other green shoots that we've seen in the last week were in the commercial real estate sector, where there's an attempt to stabilize. I'm not sure it's yet at the point of revitalizing the sector, but it's certainly stabilizing, and that's also important. Those are the two big obstacles to inward investment into China. There are others that China will work through, and dare I say it, the outcome of the midterm elections in the U.S. is also helpful because it provides at least a little bit of a sense that there can be an element of centrist continuity. Even if the next president is a Republican, it seems a little bit less likely that it's a dogmatic Republican and a little bit more likely that it's somebody who might continue the policies of the current administration. So I think that the things are shaping up in a reasonably encouraging way, and we're continuing with our investments in China and the U.S. and connecting the two as much as we ever have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Anne, in what's been a tough year for equity markets worldwide, Chinese stocks in Hong Kong have been among the worst hit, and foreign investors have pulled $176 billion out of onshore Chinese stocks and bonds in the first 9 months of the year. So, have you been selling too? Firstly, and secondly, how should we read the recent rebound? Is this a good time to buy?
It's very interesting because the dynamics in Asia versus the dynamics in the US and Europe are quite different, and we are more positive on Asia as a region, both from a market perspective as well as from a flow perspective for 2023. We can certainly see increasing interest, if not action yet, on region as a whole, including China, as we look into 2023, partly because I think people are beginning to see the other side of some of the real estate challenges, but also there's a lot of optimism about where China is in its own interest rate policy cycle and the benefits that will bring for the region, as well as the kind of gradual opening up, which everyone is hopeful for. So I think that, as a scene set, probably sets Asia in general and China as part of that up for a more positive and earlier, if you like, rebound in sentiment than perhaps we're seeing in other parts of the world. I think there's another quite important point that I want to just come back on between the conversation you and Bill were having just now, though, which is around that supply chain point and whether, how vulnerable the supply chain is. Because I think one of the things that we've seen from the conversations that we've had with a lot of our companies through the pandemic is not because of the geopolitics per se, but because of the unexpected dislocation that happened during the pandemic as ports shut down, as transportation systems shut down. Companies were unaware of their single points of failure in that supply chain. And effectively, the way companies were operating on a just-in-time basis relied on insurance to take away the worst-case scenario. And actually, that proved quite difficult in some instances because of the pandemic. What we're seeing now is, I think, supply chain design, which has some optionality in it. Now, it's interesting, though, you said it was inflationary. I think it's quite interesting when you think completely through cycle, whether it will be inflationary or whether it's just better protected against, it might be more expensive year by year, but over the totality of the cycle, if you're avoiding the really big dip downs, I'm not so clear that it is, but I think the profile of expense in that. So, I think that supply chain redesign, that idea of optionality, more of a matrix approach to build better resilience into the system, I think is one of the benefits, if I can say that has come out of what we've all learned and what we see in, as I say, the companies we invest in over the last.
And which region is the biggest winner out of what you're just describing, given that we're currently here in Singapore? Is it ASEAN or is it somewhere else?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I don't think we particularly see it as simplistically as that, but I think you have seen, particularly in Asia, ASEAN realizing that it can have a greater share of the value chain in some instances than it has historically had. So I think you are seeing some shift in investment that might have historically all been optimized around one single site, perhaps being spread more widely across the region. But I think that's probably true in Europe, and you're seeing it down into Latin America as well to an extent. So I think it's probably the case that some of the smaller markets might find this as an opportunity to get involved in global supply chains in a way that they maybe didn't have that opportunity before. But I think it will be gradual, and I think it will be quite spread.
I'll chime in because you might expect me to say this, but ASEAN is booming. India is booming. Korea will benefit. Japan will benefit, but in smaller ways. But this part of the world is absolutely the growth engine. The U.S. is remarkably resilient and very, very strong. So obviously you can tell by my accent where I'm from. I'd never count the U.S. out. But growth is rotating to this part of the world, and the connection to the U.S. will remain very strong. Singapore has always had and will continue to have a very central role to play in that. So I think Singapore will be a huge beneficiary and is extremely well positioned for this shift. But obviously, the manufacturing is going to be sitting in the neighboring countries.
And Hazem, you are increasing your China footprint, I believe. InvestCorp recently announced a partnership for a new Greater Bay fund. Can you tell us about the rationale for doing that, and any details? When's your targeted close? What kind of things are you going to buy?
So first, it is sad to see the decoupling between the U.S. and China. When you look at the world's two largest economies, you'd have loved that there is a very harmonious relationship which will benefit everyone. But it is what it is. Now, if I have to choose from the U.S. versus China, you can't choose. That's the reality. You got to be as active in North America as in the U.S. as you are in China. Why is that? I think every single one in this room probably can have made money in the U.S. in some shape or form. It is the most resilient market. It always bounces back quickly, and it's got liquidity. The three anchor ingredients for an investor to make money. Okay. We have had our ups and downs, but we consistently made money in the U.S., whether it's private equity, whether it's real estate, whether it's credit, and what have you. And that will continue in our professional lifetime. Okay. So in that respect, as a global investor, regardless your political views, a presence or an allocation to North America is very important in your portfolio. On the other hand, China is attractive, but for very different reasons. China, in a way, is that kind of that growth capital story that has been growth capital for the last 20 years and continues to be the growth capital for the next 10 years, or 20 years or plus. So in that respect, it's got some fantastic momentum, dynamics, and kind of macro factors that it's very difficult to ignore. And in that respect, I think it is quite important. Now, for us, why the GBA? I should say, before I talk about the GBA, one observation which we feel is going to be a big part in the next decade is inward China investment. And we think that's going to significantly enhance the tech universe within China. We believe, like in the next few decades, whatever you see this tech phenomena that has happened in the US in the last 40 years, we're seeing the birth of that in China. And that's why, if you ask us, we're probably kind of tech venture capital investing in China by Chinese LPs and investors locally, I think is going to be a big part, and I hope we can be a participant in it. Greater Bay Area, I think most of you here probably know more about it than I do. The size of Germany, the population of Germany, and probably the industrial and technology hub for China. For us, it reminds me when I started in private equity in Europe 30 years ago. It feels like Europe 30 years ago. Just getting started, there's a lot of pluses and minuses and government interference and what have you, but it's okay. And in a way, we feel that fast forward 2 decades, that's probably going to be one of the most exciting and active private equity markets in the world. We're very thrilled to see a lot of private wealth, particularly out of Hong Kong, family offices, who share that enthusiasm and that patriotism to be one of the active investors in that region.
Yeah. If I could add, I think with the US and China working together or even compete on some of the areas such as, say, who come up the fast on climate technology, mRNA, it's a good thing for the world in the way of collaboration or competition that working together to solve the world problem. Because simply put, that climate had no borders and cancer had no borders, right? So if something that would be great, we invest on both sides and we look at their entrepreneurship on both sides. And increasingly, we're actually seeing, in China, we're seeing just very traditional investment opportunity. I completely agree with you earlier said that businesses that could be just basic businesses, could be shoe retailer, could be drugstore chain, or could be vet clinics, that we think that you could actually leverage technology to make it better, to make a store more efficient, how to make the experience better, to make the consumer journey much better. It works on both sides, and we are seeing that we have consumer investments across US, China, and Europe that behind the similar philosophy. How do you make that consumer journey in a complete and closed-loop way? So I think there's a lot we could do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Can I just follow up on that, sort of thinking about Hillhouse's corporate history? I guess, obviously you have very strong Chinese roots and you've grown into an Asian and a global player. But what you just said, does that imply you will deploy as much capital in China as you have previously?
Well, we look for where the best opportunities are. I think there's a lot of things that you could do. And I think, again, you just take a different set of lens. The lens is where you could add value, where the opportunities, on the consumer technology, we see again, like the pharmacy store we talked about, that's just wonderful to apply some of the technology to make the retailers more efficient. It could happen in China, could happen in Vietnam, could happen in Indonesia, could happen in other places. I think it's all pretty exciting. I think there's a lot of things that can leverage technology, make it better. I think the one particular point I want to emphasize is this whole idea of technology just being a creative disruptor, but you could actually leverage that to make an enabler. So how do you, particularly as a private equity firm, when you buy out companies, how do you leverage technology, say, hey, to make it more efficient, but also trying to sort of educate your workforce, make them more efficient, make them participate in that growth of the companies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm conscious that we're nearly out of time, and I wanted to touch on something we haven't discussed so far, which is crypto. I can imagine, if depending on the timing and the speakers of a panel called Financing the New Economy, this could have been a long discussion about how much of that financing would be on a blockchain and what that would look like. But the industry is in crisis right now. So I want to ask, and any of you can answer, is this the moment that institutional investors sort of pick the low and sense the opportunity and buy more heavily into crypto? Or is this the moment where institutional investment in crypto dies?
Happy. Sorry.
Well, I think it's the wrong question in a way, because I think certainly from, where I sit, and I'm guessing sort of Bill and some of the others maybe too, the really interesting thing about the evolution of crypto was not a whole bunch of different coins that were created. It's actually the infrastructure that it sits underneath it and the transformative effect that distributed ledger technology could have on a big chunk of the financial system supply chain. Because one of the things that I find so fascinating about the way that the financial infrastructure of the world has been set up is it's very, very analog. I mean, take something as simple as the settlement periods on exchanges. Now, they're still measured in days. Really, in this day and age, they shouldn't be. And the interesting impact of distributed ledger technology, blockchain or others, is that the disruptive power in that financial system and the potential to remove an awful lot of friction in that financial system, I think is immense. So I think crypto gets the headlines. I think the progress on finding the right use cases for the infrastructure continues, and that has still enormous potential to be used across all of the financial of the financial industry.
So it's possible to separate those two things, the kind of market chaos from the underlying work.
Yes.
No, but you can't separate them, and it's completely right. The infrastructure is extremely powerful and will be deployed. But let's not count out the cryptocurrencies, which is one application. Bitcoin is trading at $17,000. There's just been a seismic event, absolutely seismic, on top of a series of seismic events. It's not going away. There's appetite in the world for a non-fiat currency. It's not going to take over the world, in my opinion, but there's a role to play. Institutional investors are already there and will be there ongoing. So let's make sure that we support it properly. What's going to happen? All of that stuff, that ecosystem, is going to come into the regulated institutional environment because it's just too risky to sit out with a bunch of cowboys who have managed to blow themselves up.
And Hazem, I know you had a view on this.
Well, I agree with what Dan said. I think the crypto gets the headline, but really it's the blockchain technology, which is it's a must for the future. It will facilitate us moving to a paperless economy, and also one where we don't measure things in days but in seconds. And I think that is a must. So in that respect, kind of the capital that flew into the broader crypto definition is okay because it helped create a platform or an infrastructure which will be very helpful for the future. Now, as any digital currency also, it's also the way of the future, whether it's Bitcoin or, I don't know, dollar coin, whatever it is. But I think this is where regulators need to play an active role in regulating that industry in exactly the same way that every other industry is regulated. I think in the US, they made a decision 9 months ago that not the SEC, but the Commodities Commission, which will be the one that's going to regulate cryptocurrencies. It raised a lot of question marks in my mind, kind of because how it is being perceived today as a commodity as opposed to anything else. But I think it's a very, very important part of the future. And I mean, we all remember the dot-com crash in 2000, but also going back to the Black Monday in the 20s. That was also the industrial sector crash. So all these new kind of hyper sectors when they first get started, you got this overexcitement hype, and then kind of there's a correction, and then we learn from it and we regulate. So perhaps we are in that period of learning from it. As institutional investors, to answer your direct question, should institutional investors go into crypto, the currency itself? I would be cautious myself. I think as institutions, you've got fiduciary responsibilities to a whole slew of investors, and on a risk measure, on a risk-reward basis, I don't think it's there yet.
Okay. I would add that I agree. I think this just so early, such early innings, just still has a lot of potential, I believe, ahead of that. But I wanted to add that it's like what I observe is just a lot of great talents coming to the industry. I think, if you could follow the talents, look at what they do, what problem they try to solve, there's a number of issues like cross-border e-wallet. There's like settlement, trading. The whole fintech infrastructure was so antique, right? So there's a lot you could do. I'm a believer on innovation. I think there are a lot could happen in the space.
So those innovations can live beyond crypto.
Yes.
I'm glad we have.
And follow the talents.
Got it. I'm glad we have an optimistic note to end on. Thank you all very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Please welcome our panellists. Founding Partner and Chief Executive Officer of Genfund, Anna Fang. Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of General Atlantic, William Ford. Managing Partner of GGV Capital, Jenny Lee. Co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of Hedda Sophia, Ian Osborne. And our moderator, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Willett Advisors, Steve Ratner.
Good morning, everybody. So I heard the end of the last panel, and we're going to cover a little bit of that same ground from a different perspective. We have four very distinguished private market investors here, and we're going to cover the world, and we're going to cover China, and we might even get to crypto before it's over. But let me start with the world. It's been obviously a tumultuous year in the markets, public and private, and a lot of resetting going on, a lot of recalibration, and a big slowdown in activity, at least from what we can see at Willett. So I'd like to start maybe with Bill and ask you, you invest all over the world in all kinds of different industries. You're not just a tech investor, you do a lot of stuff. What's your current mindset about the investing landscape? What are you looking at? What do you think is interesting? And what are you saying to yourself, I'm not going to do that again?
Yeah, definitely I'll answer that last question. I think the transition to the digital economy is alive and well. We're still seeing a tremendous amount of innovation and entrepreneurship around the world. And while there has been a reset in the public markets, a significant reset, and now that's translating into the private markets. The entrepreneurship innovation in a range of areas of technology, whether it's Web3, artificial intelligence, things pivoting off 5G, it's all still very, very exciting. And I would also just add in life sciences. I think that's a particularly interesting area. We're seeing innovation continuing, and I think given the reset in public markets and the need for capital, that's a particularly interesting area. But that plus, I would just add, the idea that global economic growth is migrating towards Asia, whether it's India, Southeast Asia, or China. I think that trend is intact and will continue to create opportunities.
So from a geographic point of view, in terms of the areas you find most interesting, is Asia at the top of your list, or is the U.S. still? And how do you feel about Europe, given everything that's going on there?
Southeast Asia and India are at the top of the list right now. I think India is going to have its moment. With the digital India is upon us. 450 million wireless internet users on the Geo platform, leading to a lot of innovation there. I think that'll be a particularly interesting area. I think Southeast Asia benefiting from, basically the idea that people are diversifying supply chains, GDP per capita moving up, a lot of interesting innovations. We're seeing a lot of interesting activity in Vietnam and Indonesia in particular. So I think they would be at the top of the list of areas that we're focusing on right now.
Relative to Europe or the United States?
I mean, Europe, despite having, maybe being in recession already or being, there's still a lot of interesting things going on there in terms of tech and entrepreneurship. I think it's a mistake to rule it out, so to speak. And the U.S. to me is showing a lot of resilience. In lots of aspects of the economy, despite inflation, rising rates, it seems to be, in my view, hanging in there quite well.
Ian, you also invest on a global basis. So how do you see the world? And give us some reactions to what Bill said in terms of where you might agree or hopefully disagree.
I think we agree on Southeast Asia. I think the proposition here is very compelling. And the demographics and the growth rates remain, exceptional. And the commodities boom in Indonesia and things have helped the local market be propped up. There's also a wave of Chinese talent that's moved to Singapore from Hong Kong and mainland China the last couple of years. And so the ecosystem here is far more developed than before. In Europe, we think it's quite interesting, not because the macroeconomics are compelling, quite the opposite, but because 3/4 of all the growth capital that came into Europe last year was from non-European investors. And as that money pulls back and focuses closer to home in the US or from Asia, the prices have reset perhaps further in Europe than they have in the US or China. And so we do think that Europe's pretty compelling, and it's particularly compelling for us in fintech, given that the banks and the financial institutions of Europe haven't recovered since the last financial crisis. And so the opportunity to disrupt the traditional players in fintech in Europe is far greater than the US, where the traditional banks, Visa, MasterCard, the insurers are in pretty good health. We don't cover India, so I'll skip over that. But I'd say to Bill's point about biotech, there's a lot of innovation happening clearly. We also see more and more in synthetic biology.
More and more what?
In synthetic biology. And both in China and the US and Europe, a lot of talent is going into that space. Artificial intelligence, too. The challenge of AI is so much of that technology is still very early. And it's hard sometimes to invest in, because almost all of those companies get acquired as opposed to IPOs down the line.
Well, we look at some biotech stuff, but honestly, by the third sentence, I'm having trouble following the science. And so how do you invest in biotech? You have a relatively small firm. I don't know that you have a biotech division per se.
We don't do biotech per se. We do synthetic biology, which is sort of for us at the intersection of artificial intelligence, machine learning, traditional computer science, and biology. And so the talent that's gone into that has come out of companies like DeepMind, who built their own independent spun-off business going after the pharmaceutical industry. I think you'll see more and more companies that with traditional computer science marrying that with biotech capabilities. And so actually China's seen a lot of space in the last 2-3 years, and it's a national priority as well. So you're seeing that not just in the US, but increasingly in Europe and China.
So, Jenny, you're based in Southeast Asia, although I know your firm invests globally. You're presumably focused more on this part of the world. So I guess what these guys had to say may be music to your ears, or how do you see your market?
Yeah, so we've been investing. I've been investing in the global market, U.S., China, and Southeast Asia over the last 22 years. I have to say that, as a global firm, we were looking at technology as an enabler for disruption, innovation on a global basis. But today, that lens has changed. I think to your starting point and your message, the world has changed, more complex, more bipolar. And so when we look at technology today, we will bunch them into policy sensitive and policy non-sensitive. So in that sense, if you look at policy...
You're speaking about every country or China?
Global, from a global perspective.
Yeah.
And so if we look at policy non-sensitive areas, these are areas that has been, for example, in the enterprise space, enterprise software, software for the small, medium-sized enterprise, infrastructure software that's enabling companies to migrate their data, their system onto the cloud, right? This is one area where we classify as policy insensitive because it is actually driven by digitization that has been accelerated over the last 2 to 3 years with COVID, right? And so in that sense, we are seeing similar investable trend both in the US, in China, and also in Southeast Asia. There may be a workflow amendment that has to be done to accommodate this. But in the world of rising inflation, the impetus to actually use more remote software in that sense actually has gone up. So this is one area where we do see that it's relatively policy insensitive global drivers. The other area that falls into this camp would be automation. Right, today, and when think again about rising labor costs, declining labor dividend, we are now dealing with the fact that we do have to consider labor hybrid, a hybrid model where you're using automation, whether it's software or robotics to work. And that actually is happening, again, not just in the US, as we're seeing many of the factories, as Amazon take a look at their headcount refinement, they're going to have to use more and more automation as well to supplement, the excess capacity need that they need. So this is a demand that's not just something that we are seeing in the US. We are seeing that in China with factories, sometimes, in lockdown mode, sometimes opening up mode. That means they need that flex in capacity enhancement as well. And so the automation wave we are actually observing has actually gone beyond just an ROI consideration into now a hybrid workforce enhancement. And same thing. In Southeast Asia, the driver may be a little different. In Southeast Asia, most of the infrastructure for cities, for countries, they are aging infrastructure. And so when they leapfrog into the next 4.5, 5G, that automation wave comes in as well. So those are trends that we are seeing on the policy non-sensitive area. And now, if you go to the policy-sensitive areas, then we are going to deep tech, right? So, unfortunately, technology now has a label, which it shouldn't be. And in this case, then we are talking about very sensitive technology. When we talk about semiconductor, for example, then we see that in this way, the investment opportunity is going to tend to be a bit more regional, local. China is going to have and support their own group of companies in China, from semiconductor foundries all the way to tools, similarly to the US as well. And so I would say that that's how we look at the new lens of investment, not just one to change the world, but I guess the world is now broken into little, still huge pieces. But I think tech will have its own regional focus in this case.
Bill, you mentioned India. We just spent, my colleagues and I, 3 days in India. Yeah. And as you know, India has always been something about to happen, and more hope than promise, and all the jokes about India stands for, I won't do it again, I'll never do it again, and stuff like that. So do you think this time India is for real? It sounds like from your comments about where you're spending your time, you think India is for real.
I think yes, for a couple of reasons. And we've been investing there for about 20 years, and our initial success was in the business process outsourcing IT services area, which was entrepreneur-driven and led to companies like Infosys and several others that were quite successful. And I think we're having a rebirth of that entrepreneurship around the digital economy. And really what was missing was a platform like Geo that reduced the data cost and increased access dramatically. I mean, even 5-7 years ago, it was the most expensive data, the cost of data in the world, and the number of people that were connected to fast internet was quite small. Now you've got the complete opposite situations. 450 million people, second lowest data cost in the world. And on top of that, you're seeing a whole series of services, fintech, many other things that are happening. E-commerce is taking off. Media is taking off. So I think the conditions are better. It has, it's one of the only IPO markets that's actually open right now. It's the Indian IPO market. So the conditions are there. Let's put it this way, Steve. I think it's theirs to lose if they capitalize on what is in place now.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I want to turn to China in a minute, but before I do that, I'd like to also, just in the spirit of going back over what's happened in the last year or so, talk about some lessons learned and what you guys have come away from that experience in terms of how you're going to invest going forward. And let me start with Anna, because she hasn't had a chance to talk yet, but she's going to talk a lot about China in a minute. But before we do that, Anna, as you look, because China's also obviously had its big correction as well, not just the policy stuff, but the markets certainly. And as you look at all that, what lessons do you take away in terms of how you're going to invest going forward, if any?
The number one lesson for me is one word, which is exit. I don't think we did enough of it when the market was good. I think that there's always optimism and greed that come in, and you never want to sell. And for us as angel investors, we can always sell into future rounds before the IPO, and we've done that. I mean, we have 99 exits, but a lot of them rather small. But you got to do that when the market is good. And I think actually in China, there's probably a window in the next 3 to 5 years too, where we can do that. So, because I think as investors, you're really judged by exits and how much capital you'll return. And so, for me, that's really the most important thing, and that's what I'm hopefully focusing on the next 5 years. But
of course, there are some investors who basically say, you want to compound, and the longer you hold it in a great company, the more you're going to compound, and ultimately that's how the value gets created.
There are all these stories about people who sold Tencent early, and certainly if we had a ByteDance, we wouldn't want to sell that, right? But sometimes you just never know, and I think so far with the exits we've done, we haven't regretted it. And for us, it's maybe just taking a piece off the table before the IPO. But when that window is there, that's just time to focus on that. So that's probably the number one lesson that I think,
Ian?
I think the biggest mistake in the industry, and including for us, is one of governance the last few years. Almost all of the major screw-ups that we've seen very publicly have been a failure of governance. A lack of a proper board which holds the founders to account, often a lack of scrutiny around secondary transactions, related party questions. And so I think in a very hot market the last couple of years, there were certain people, investors out there who are pushing the boundaries in terms of no governance whatsoever, extremely founder-friendly terms, which they position as helping the founders. But frankly, actually, most founders, the average age of our portfolio company CEOs is 30 years old. And so you want to have some checks and balances. And I think in a very hot market, there's pressure to have fewer checks and balances if you want to win the competition. And so, I think for the most part, we managed to avoid some of the high-profile mistakes. But the handful of mistakes that we've made in the last couple of years have been ones where the governance has not been strong enough in those companies, and the founders have had probably a little bit too much rope to hang themselves with.
So exits, governance, but I haven't yet heard valuation. Did you pay too much? Not you specifically, but did all of us who invest pay too much over the last year or two for some of these companies?
Absolutely. I think valuation became disconnected from fundamentals and was trying to attach itself to market size. Hey, we've got a big enough TAM so we can justify this large valuation. But we didn't think about, how fast could the company sustainably grow? What was the long-term profitability? What was the long-term business model? We disconnected from that. And that led to, I think, a significant inflation in valuation, and that we're paying the price for now. And I think the healthiest thing, and actually it's happened even faster than I would have thought, is the reconnection to the point like, okay, what is a sustainable growth rate? What is a sustainable operating margin? Does this have a real business model? And just more discipline around capital. I mean, capital felt free, right? We'll raise the next round. Use as much money as you can or need to drive top line growth. And now I think there's just a new discipline coming back in. It's long term, it's healthy, but there's some pain to be had for having paid too much and raised too much money at too high a price.
Certainly discipline on the side of the investors. It's not obvious to me yet that the recipients of the capital have yet accepted the new reality of what they're going to have.
I think some have. Some are realizing that they've got to have sufficient whatever they have has got to get them to break even and get them profitability, putting in some real cost disciplines. Some have not. One place, Steve, that it's starting to happen, though, is around employees. It's employees who are saying, we're not worth $12 billion. You're not going to give me options at $12 billion. We're worth a lot lower than that. And so I think that's actually the first place is the issuance of equity to employees is happening at significantly lower levels than the last round.
Yeah.
And that's causing a little bit of a return to reality. But we're in the early, just the last comment from me, we're in the early innings of the reset in private market values. I mean, it's not done. It may be 2 quarters into a 4 to 6 quarter phenomenon, in my view.
Do you see a reset coming, Jenny, in valuation?
I think the reset has arrived. So for the public company, I think the wake-up call has come in loud and clear, and valuation is staring you in the face. On the private side, I think the first 10, 11 months of this year, what we have seen is that there's been a lot more funding activities on the early stage companies, the pre-A, the A's, early B's relative to the C's, D's. So in that sense, the wake-up call is there for the early stage companies trying to raise their 10, 20 million in the A, pre-A. Valuations has come down anywhere from 30 to 50%. Whereas I think for the group of companies that's raised a lot of capital over the last 2 years, these are the D's, E's, and F. I think they're still waiting for the wake-up call, right? Because they have 2 to 3 years of cash run. They're not in the market right now. They're hearing all these things coming, and they feel like they still have time to allow growth to happen in the next 1 or 2 years. So I would say that for the larger size companies, I think we will be in a very good environment where you can come in maybe at the last round valuation, discount to last round, but at a company that's further growth. In our portfolio, we have seen that the larger companies are still growing at pretty good 40 to 50% medium revenue growth rate. So the growth is happening, but obviously multiple contraction has happened, and therefore they would need to work a lot harder, not just at the top line, but in terms of EBITDA, getting to cash flow as well to justify the valuation that they got in the last 2 years. So I agree with Bill. I think that the hunting is going to get even better in the next 2 to 3 years. But it will require us to be extremely patient and to wait for the companies to be ready.
So let's segue into China. And Anna, let's talk about both valuations but also activity. What's the level of investing activity there? I think it's slowed down as it has in the rest of the world, but there's obviously some very specific reasons in China it might have slowed down. So why don't you give us a picture of what the investing climate in China is today?
Actually, the number of deals we're seeing per week and the number of deals going to IC is relatively unchanged for the past few years, which means there's still a lot of entrepreneurs. The number of investments we're making is probably a third of what we did 2-3 years ago, and that's a result of a higher bar and just what we like to see in the market. in terms of write-ups every week, which I think kind of is a signal to activity level in the VC world. We used to get, I mean, we have a large portfolio, so we probably got 10 write-ups per week. Now we have about 3, and they're all
You're talking about write-ups and valuation.
Write-ups and valuation that other people give our companies.
Right.
So we used to get 10, so that was a lot, and now it's only 3 average. And they happen at the valuations are lower, which means the activity happening is at the early stage, I would say, up to Series B. In fact, official data, I think about 60-70% of the deals are happening sort of through seed A, a little bit for B. 6% is like Series C. So people are investing for smaller companies this year. Very little activity in things at later stage. Last year we had a company, Red, that I guess I can't say, but multi-billion dollar. We share this for a large write-up, but we haven't seen one of those astronomical companies this year, I think, so far.
Because other investors aren't coming into the later stage and creating the valuations for you. Is that what you're saying?
I think the main reason is things are so cheap in the public market. And I think that private market hasn't adjusted. If you ask me, I think public market prices are so attractive right now that I'm sure a lot of people in the room even have FOMO about not investing.
Well, some of them have FOMO and some of them have already run for the hills.
Exactly. And I would venture to say some have FOMO.
But when you say you're doing fewer investments, so you're being more careful, more cautious, more conservative. Is that why, or why is your actual investing pace slowed down?
If you look at the people who are doing startups now, so I think for me, last year when there was a demise of a few industries last summer that caught everyone by surprise, we really also asked ourselves: can we continue to invest in this environment? And thinking through that question for me was, can I still find exciting entrepreneurs? And we found a host of them. I continue to find them. So there are a lot of Chinese people doing startups. There are a few new pockets of people doing startups. One is the scientific community, because as China has laid out the sectors that, from top down, that they would like to see, like new materials, climate tech, biotech, security, any tech, self-sufficiency. All these characters. There are a lot of professors and scientists who have come out to do startups. I'm not against them, but I think that a lot of the structures of entrepreneurship that they've set up, it's not something that I find very attractive, which is they're not really full-time. A lot of them are famous people who have a technology, but not very entrepreneurial, in my opinion. So I think I've actually stayed away from some of those type of investments, but I think my peers have done a lot of those. So I think that's one reason why we've had fewer this year. Second...
Because there's more of those kind of folks coming?
Yes, because they represent the hard tech, deep tech.
I see, right.
And we've still done some of those, but I think you have to have someone who's willing to do this full time and not do it sort of opportunistically. Because we follow founders, and our whole criteria is about the founders. It's less about what they do. But it happens to be those people, I think, are less entrepreneurial than I would like. The other crop is just the one that we're spending more time with is actually just young people. There are a lot of young founders who are relatively unfazed by what's going on in the macro environment because they've never experienced it. They might be a little more naive. And so they continue to see the world a different way. So those are the founders that I love most. And what are they doing now? They're doing a lot of AIGC related, generating content either for speech, video, text, like live streaming. That I think is the future, kind of like what OpenAI is working for. And that's really something I think we'll see in the next 10 to 30 years in some shape or form. A lot of them are doing drug discovery, leveraging AI for drug discovery and R&D, kind of like a benchling. And then a lot are doing things for like AR, VR. I'm not a big believer in short-term AR, VR, but I think down the line, what's coming after the iPhone, I think there will be some sort of human-product relationship in some form that involves haptics and the rest of the body probably, And I think people are building technologies for that. I mean, the young Chinese people. And then, so that's a group of the young talent. And then I think there's a third group that we call long Chinese, because there are some Chinese people who have built global companies like ByteDance, Xiaomi, DJI. And I think the talent is strong enough, there's no argument there, that they're building companies globally directly. And some of those might not live in China when they do this. They might move to Singapore and the US, and I think these countries should think about how to give them visas, to be honest. But I think that for that talent, we call it long Chinese, and we're also doing that. And Web3 is actually talent going there as well.
But you made an allusion to the policy changes in certain sectors, and we all know, for example, online education was essentially, for-profit education, essentially shut down by the government like overnight. So, and there's been obviously a series of policy pronouncements since then, policy changes even in the last week or so since the Party Congress. So have you changed your investing strategy in terms of sectors based on the government's emphasis on certain policy areas and staying away from some where you think it's become more sensitive, or how do you invest around these complicated policy pronouncements that seem to come out somewhat surprisingly?
I mean, I don't expect any more to come. So I think the most important, I think that if they have listed the ones they want you to invest in, right? But actually, I think it's more around not investing in some of the education, or even though they're not, I mean, you have to kind of read between and kind of know what the sensitive information is and just kind of avoid that. But I think for us, we're just kind of following the founders, because the founders aren't doing ed tech startups anyway. So we had to change less than I thought, is what I'm saying, because basically all the founders are kind of doing a lot of what was or what is in a general framework of acceptable, whether on purpose or not. But I mean, I think even though, for example, AIGC is not something on the list, but that's just where the world is probably going and what international founders are doing. And I don't think, I mean, there's no harm in doing that, I think. And I think very importantly, I want to point out on this innovation in the government is Vice President Wang Qishan yesterday said the way forward, and I was ecstatic and semi-surprised to hear this, but the way forward was innovation. And innovation was brought up 22 times in the 20th Party Congress. So I think the government is really, I don't know if it's a result of what happened last summer, but I think the government is really interested in supporting innovation entrepreneurship. And in fact, after the 20th Party Congress, we got a lot of invitations to attend meetings about promoting innovation and entrepreneurship. So I think if that part of the policy and economy is there, it's great.
So I'm going to take all that as a kind of positive, constructive, still doing a lot of business in China and still excited about China. We've got three other panelists who, although they invest globally, also invest in China. So let's see if they agree with you or not, Ian.
So I think what we really agree on is the China to world strategy, the young Chinese entrepreneurs who want to build global businesses. I think the complications as a foreign investor in China and some of the domestic economy is greater. And I think there's a lot of positivity after the last few weeks, but I think people want to wait and see how that transpires over the next few months and years before rushing back into some of those sectors and in some of the later stages. But I think when you look at the largest three Chinese companies for the last 10 years, ByteDance, Binance, and Shein, are all essentially serving the global market. And two of them don't have a single Chinese user. One of them has half Chinese and half non-Chinese users. And so we do see that sort of young Chinese entrepreneurs building global businesses, initially from China, but over time they increasingly migrate headquarters to Singapore, the US, or elsewhere. And I think that we're very bullish on.
So the China to the rest of the world strategy rather than the domestic China strategy is how you...
Well, and look, I think the domestic China strategy, it works in some of the areas, the kind of policy-sensitive areas, electric vehicles, batteries, semiconductors, some of the areas of biotech. But I think that some of those areas are quite capital-intensive and potentially have lower rates of return over time than the kind of internet economy of the last 10 years. I mean, the cost of building a gigafactory is very different than the cost of building a algorithm-based social product. And so I think it's unquestionably some great companies to be built there over the next few years in China, but whether those will be the same rates of return for foreign investors, I'm skeptical.
Jenny, how do you weigh China against the rest of Asia that you also invest in?
Yeah, so we have been active in China. I think, as I mentioned, while the pace has come down as well, the bar has gone up. The areas where we've been particularly still very focused in terms of investment, I think one is the whole EV area. Along climate tech, it's not just about, so we're seeing that electrification of vehicles is happening at the edge, right? And what that is doing is that it's forcing a reconstruction of the energy grid from a very centralized power grid historically to now a very distributed grid. If you're going to support electric car charging at the home, in commercial buildings, in public facility as well, the entire stack has to change. And I think because of that, we are seeing new innovation, new startups that are now trying to address this issue of that energy transition change. In the sense, these are companies, and coupled with the fact that China has very deep manufacturing expertise in areas to do with energy storage, right? When you think about solar panels, you think about wind blades, 80-90% of the hardware is actually manufactured in China. If you extract and look at it, are they data sensitive? They are not, right? If you buy a solar panel on my home, it's my data, I own it, I just bought the hardware. So in that sense, in this vertical, this is where we see that China still has opportunities to create companies that can be global outcome, and at the same time be able to contribute, to what we call, whether it's climate tech or energy transition. So this is one area that we are seeing actually pretty big upcoming company. And then if you look at it, EVs, right? So cars, you have the European cars, you have American cars, Japanese cars. In a way, there's never one car that everybody around the world wants to own, right? There's multiple models, and so as a result, it's pretty fragmented. And so you can believe that it is possible to actually have China also come out with the new energy cars, and they could be part of the global ecosystem. I think the other areas I mentioned and alluded to is automation. I think that the fact that automation is a combination of not just the AI, the compute, the visioning, but also the robotics arm, and then associated with that, the entire back-end manufacturing. So it's actually a system integration stack. And so when you apply the system integration stack of automation, whether to warehouse, logistics, lab, or even drug discovery, then we're now seeing that, again, this is one where, from a data-sensitive perspective, the data is owned by the owner of, if you're lab using the system, you actually own this data. So in that sense, there are definitely areas that are not data sensitive. And so it's also one area where we have seen, I wouldn't name the names, but we've seen Chinese companies having revenue over 60-70% global, with customers from Japan, US, Europe actually buying into the product. Now, the key question, though, is that with the current environment that we're in, definitely we're seeing that entrepreneurs, they go where the capital, they go where the market opportunities is. And so a lot of the frequent discussion we have with our entrepreneurs in different stages is, how do I now have an alternative headquarter? Right, so they're not labeled as a China-only company trying to sell to the world, but can they have multiple headquarters where they're also willing to locate some of the manufacturing or the assembly into regional areas to allow them to support global growth. So I would say business as is probably not possible, but how do you now work with these companies, the great companies, to figure out how they can continue to sell globally, but in a more distributed manner as well.
Bill, you've obviously done a lot in China. You're on the board of ByteDance, I believe, which is one of the great China success stories. But again, as I said at the beginning, you invest all around the world. So how do you weight China at the moment in terms of interesting opportunity or less interesting opportunity?
Well, I'd like to tie together what Anna, Ian, and Jenny said in that I think China for China is still a very good opportunity. It's a large growing market, consumer, healthcare, higher spending, very attractive. China for the world, I think very interesting. We think of ByteDance actually as a global internet company with Chinese heritage. And I think when you take Shein, ByteDance, Binance, many others, they really are serving the world. So I think China for the world is still there. And I think what Anna said, the innovation economy and the quality of the entrepreneurs is still extremely high. And in certain areas like EV, climate tech, AI, they're global leaders. I mean, they're either at par or ahead of the world. So you have to, as a global investor and a growth tech investor, you have to be focused on China. Now, what's changed is the risk profile has changed in a significant way. And it's changed because of U.S.-China relations. We might get outbound investment screening that says we can't invest in certain parts of China that have certain national security implications. We don't know how wide that's going to be. That's one significant change. The exit environment, for so long we had basically the VIE structure, Cayman companies list in Hong Kong, NASDAQ, New York quite easily. That's being called into question now in terms of where can we exit, and we talked a bit about exits before. That formula is probably over, and just elevated geopolitical issues related to China. And so very attractive, but the risk profile and the risk package is higher, and we've got to factor that all into our investment decision making.
But what you didn't mention as a risk factor is Chinese policies, that you could wake up one day and find that they've made some policy shift here or there, and whether they
I should have, Steve. I should have, because if my experience at ByteDance has been, we're debating between Chinese policy issues and U.S. policy issues. It's both sides, and you may try to solve one, but you've got the other. I mean, for example, export of Chinese IP that might be used for markets outside of China. The Chinese government is very sensitive to that. What's happening to that IP? Where's it going? And the same, the U.S. government is sensitive to what capital expertise is going into China to help them build their domestic technology industry. So it's both sides, and I think what that's meant for all of us is that the level of risk is higher, the investment decision making is tougher, and there's certain areas that we're probably going to have to avoid because the risks are too complicated or unknowable or unsolvable. But I'd still say, with the second biggest economy in the world still growing, I think when they come out of COVID, they'll return to growth. It's too big to ignore. There's too much opportunity.
But what I'm hearing from all of you, and we're out of time, so this will be, I guess, the last comment. What I hear from all of you is more caution about China, both for a better assessment of all the risks, evaluations, all that kind of stuff, and not doing certain sectors, not doing certain kinds of investments, but still interested in China, but a little more careful about it.
Absolutely.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you, panelists. This was fun. Thank you, audience. And on to the next.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.
This is working. That those of you who have signed up for breakouts, they're being held on the second floor in rooms Sentosa 1, 2, and 3. And for those who signed up for the Smart Cities Fireside Chat, please head to the living room on the 4th floor. And of course, if you have any questions about any of that, best place to go would be the help desk on the 2nd floor, just at the top of the stairs. Enjoy your lunch.